Ah yes, the Victorian era, the age of empire, top hats, and tuberculosis, where children wore lace collars to funerals and birthday parties, and the cure for most illnesses was either bleed it out or try exiting life slower. It was a time when Britain ruled the world and couldn't figure out how to refrigerate milk. Now, while the Victorian upper crust dined on swan terrine and champagne-soaked everything, the real action, the culinary chaos worth remembering, was happening down in the sootier, soot-covered streets, because that's where junk food was born. Not the kind that comes in shiny plastic bags with marketing teams and mascots, but the kind that was hawked on street corners, made in alleyways, and often contained ingredients like guess and hope. The good news, you've got a snack. The bad news, you're playing digestive roulette. Forget your Doritos and your questionable TikTok snacks. Victorian street food made modern junk food look like kale. These weren't snacks. They were trials. You didn't eat Victorian junk food because you were hungry. You ate it because you were bored, poor, and wildly optimistic about your survival rate. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic what junk food was like in the Victorian era and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The year is 1854. You're a 10-year-old chimney sweep who hasn't bathed since Queen Victoria's wedding. You've got a penny in your pocket, soot in your lungs, and a powerful craving for something sweet. Do you head to the nearest Waitrose for a chocolate bar? No. You approach a man with 3 teeth and a wooden cart labeled sugary bits. You give him your coin. He gives you a questionable glob of candy that's sticky, warm, and slightly green, and you eat it. Because this is Victorian Britain, and nobody's invented food safety yet. It's not that the snack was bad. It's that the snack was actively trying to end you. To be fair, junk food was technically available to everyone, adults and children alike, but it was the street kids, the working-class families, and the factory drones who devoured it like their lives depended on it. Because when your job involves making matches in a toxic warehouse for 12 hours a day, a sugar stick laced with lead sounds like a nice break. So what kind of junk food are we talking about? Oh, just a casual mix of lead-dusted candies, rat meat pies, arsenic-coloured sweets, and ice cream, so unsanitary it could be considered biological warfare. These were the snacks of a generation that frankly had other things to worry about, like scarlet fever and chimney collapses. This wasn't junk food as a term of mild scorn. This was junk food, bolded, capitalized. Occasionally flammable, processed food in the 1800s just meant someone else had touched it with their bare hands, probably after petting a horse, and yet it was beloved. It was the comfort food of the downtrodden, the guilty pleasure of the street urchin, the after-school snack of the coal miner's child. It came hot, sticky, crunchy, sour, or slightly suspicious, and they couldn't get enough of it. In this series, we're going to wander through the soot-caked snack aisles of Victorian Britain. We'll explore the sugary traps sold to kids with pennies, the frozen dairy disasters that masqueraded as ice cream, the meat pies with secrets, and the bottled drinks that exploded like tiny Molotovs. But don't worry, we'll laugh as we learn. Because, well, it's funny in retrospect, especially since we're not the ones eating it. Let's just say the real flavour of the Victorian era was danger with a hint of nutmeg. So grab a questionable toffee, hold your nose, and lace up your boots. We're going back in time to see what passed for a treat, when food regulation was just a twinkle in someone's arsenic-laced eye. Just remember, don't lick anything. In the Victorian era, if you were a poor child, and odds are, you didn't get snacks from a vending machine. You didn't even get snacks from a store. No. Your version of a snack run involved sprinting across a sewage-slick street to buy a mystery treat from a man whose only hygiene policy was, "I wiped it on my sleeve." Street vendors were the unofficial food delivery system of the 19th century. They didn't wear aprons or gloves. They wore desperation. Their inventory, whatever could be boiled, fried, sugared, or vaguely congealed that morning. Their equipment, a wooden cart with one squeaky wheel, or possibly just their own coat pockets. That's right, pocket snacks, and not like cute little granola bars either. We're talking lukewarm sweets, stored directly next to lint, coins, and the occasional rat. But children flocked to them. because for just a single grubby penny, you could buy something sweet, exciting, and slightly life-threatening. And when your other options were gruel or old bread, a risk-flavored treat sounded like heaven. Let's start with the all-stars. Sugar sticks, the prequel to lollipops. Sugar sticks were the ultimate prize. Pure boiled sugar, shaped into rods, sometimes stuck on a splintery stick. Modern lollipops have plastic wrappers, maybe even jokes printed on them. Victorian sugar sticks had texture, usually from street dust, soot, or the occasional flea that wandered into the batch during cooling. The best part? The water used to make them was often straight from the local pump, which means you were licking the essence of London's finest cholera cocktail. But hey, at least it was sweet. Every lick was a gamble. Will it rot your teeth or destroy your intestines first? Gingerbread men. Now with 30% more lead, these weren't the fluffy cookies you decorate at Christmas. Victorian gingerbread men were closer to medieval throwing stars, rock hard, spiced with cloves, and cute enough to lure children in. The problem? They were often dyed red to look festive and appetizing. And what did they use for red dye? Red lead, as in the metal that makes you hallucinate and die slowly. This wasn't a scandal. It was common. Lead made the cookies look cheerful and bright. Never mind the part where it also caused vomiting, seizures, and early death. In the Victorian snack world, presentation was everything, and if a child looked slightly poisoned afterward, well, that's just how growing up worked. The real secret ingredient was whimsy. And by whimsy, we mean a neurotoxin. Raspberry drops mercury in every morsel. If you liked your candy vivid and aggressively flavored, raspberry drops were the way to go. Hard-boiled sweets, intensely sweet and tart, and stained the most beautiful red. But what made that red so eye-popping? Mercury sulfide, a compound also known as vermilion. That's right. The same mercury used in thermometers, explosives, and turning hat makers insane. It made the raspberry drops dazzle like rubies, and probably taste like fire and regret. Parents rarely questioned the safety of these candies. In fact, many assumed that if it was sold on a cart by a coughing man named Albert, it must be wholesome. The government hadn't quite invented food regulation yet. In fact, the first serious legislation to regulate food additives in the UK didn't come until the 1875 Sale of Food and Drugs Act. Before that, it was the Wild West, but with more puddings. Victorian candy didn't ask if you had allergies. It gave you new ones. Trickle pudding, molasses, mystery, and regret. A penny could also buy you a steaming hunk of trickle pudding, which sounds nice until you realize it was served by a woman named Peg, who used the same spoon for every customer, and possibly heated it with her breath. Trickle itself is a thick, sticky syrup made from sugar refining. It tastes like molasses and sadness. Street puddings were often overboiled, undersweetened, and frequently dropped on the ground and scooped back up. If they were hot, it was a miracle. If they were clean, it was a lie. But hungry kids would scarf them down like golden treasure. Because when you're working 10-hour shifts in a match factory, your taste buds are more forgiving than your lungs. So why did children love this stuff? Because it was theirs, it was accessible, it was exciting, and it was cheap. The working-class child of Victorian England didn't have toys, cartoons, or a TikTok algorithm feeding them dopamine. What they did have was a rock-hard candy cane dipped in poison, and a few precious minutes of joy before returning to whatever Victorian horror show they called a job. Sure, it burned your throat and turned your tongue blue, but for a moment, you weren't starving. In a world where childhood was short, brutal, and filled with coal dust, a pocketful of sweets, no matter how dangerous, felt like magic. Even if that magic came with a side of mercury and a mild seizure. In Victorian England, the quickest way to a child's heart was through brightly coloured sugar, and as it turns out, also the quickest way to their liver failure. Colour was everything in the 19th century sweets market. The brighter the hue, the better it sold. If your candy didn't glow like a radioactive peacock, you weren't trying hard enough. Enter the golden age of food dye madness. This wasn't some innocent era of natural beetroot colouring or spirulina extracts. No, the Victorians dove headfirst into the periodic table of doom, plucking out any compound that sparkled, shimmered, or reminded them of a festive corpse. Food regulations, please. This was the era when buyer beware was less a warning and more a government policy. Candy manufacturers didn't just flirt with poison, They threw a full-on masquerade ball with it. Let's take a tour of the most horrifying ingredients that made their way into innocent-looking treats. Copper sulfate, the minty green death. Want your candies to have a vibrant minty green hue? Just toss in some copper sulfate. It's shiny, bright, and just a touch lethal. Officially used to kill fungi and algae. It also doubled as a delightful coloring agent for sweets like green lozenges and peppermint creams. Too much copper sulfate caused nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and in some cases, a full-body breakdown that ended with your soul politely exiting stage left. Minty fresh breath, followed by minty fresh funeral. And yet, it was everywhere, because consumers loved the color, and candy makers loved profit. Nobody had to list ingredients, and most consumers couldn't read the label anyway. If a child turned slightly green, it was chalked up to weak constitution, or maybe ghosts. Lead chromate, sunshine with a side of coma. Yellow is the color of joy, lemons and school buses. In Victorian candy, yellow was also the color of lead chromate, a vivid compound that was actually used in paint. But if it could make your front door pop, why not your lemon drops? Lead chromate gave candy a rich golden glow, like the warmth of the sun distilled into sugary nuggets of neurological decay. The human body is not a fan of lead, especially in the bloodstream. Side effects included headaches, abdominal pain, paralysis, and the ever-popular complete nervous system meltdown. It's like a ray of sunshine that eats your brain, and kids loved it. The lemon drops looked divine, eye-catching, happy. A tiny dose of artificial sunlight in a soot-filled world, until your gums turned black and your hands stopped working. Arsenic trioxide, frosted, flavored, fatal. Now we get to the real celebrity of Victorian poison culture, arsenic. Used for rat poison, wallpaper, and casual homicide, arsenic trioxide somehow made its way into frosting, fondant, and decorative sugar. Why? Because it made white icing whiter. That's it. No other benefit, just a crisp, clean color that screamed, "This cake is pure," while whispering, "And so is your death." Arsenic was cheap, available, and didn't affect flavor. It was the silent killer of sweet shops. And since there were no legally required health inspections, you could go from birthday cake to casket in under 48 hours, wrapped in lace and covered in sprinkles. White frosting so pure, you'd never suspect the quiet homicide inside. And then came Manchester, 1858, a candy catastrophe, so legendary, it practically deserves its own theme park. In 1858, a candy vendor in Bradford, near Manchester, was preparing peppermint humbugs for local sale. Due to a mix-up with his supplier, instead of sugar, he received a giant sack of arsenic trioxide. He didn't question the white powder, he just dumped it in, because who needs to double-check the murder powder? The result? More than 1,200 pounds of poisoned candy hit the streets. Within hours, people were collapsing. 20 died. Over 200 were poisoned, all because someone mistook a lethal toxin for icing sugar. And what was the punishment? Not much. There was no official law preventing it. It wasn't until this event that authorities began thinking, maybe, just maybe, we should make it illegal to sell literal death dust to bakers. The tragedy did lead to the rise of food safety campaigns, but not before decades of snack-based body counts had already racked up. Before 1858, food adulteration was more of a party trick than a crime. Why did no one stop it? 2 words, no regulations. The government at the time didn't even pretend to inspect food vendors. There were no ingredient lists, no safety tests, and no warning labels. If your toffee glowed in the dark, you were either lucky or about to die inventively. And for candy makers, using poisonous dyes wasn't negligence. It was marketing. Bright colors meant more sales. More sales meant more income. And nobody wanted to buy grey sweets in a grey city during grey weather from a man with grey teeth. If the candy didn't sparkle, the customers wouldn't either. So the next time you unwrap a store-bought candy and check the label for red 40 or yellow 5, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Sure, today's dyes might be controversial, but at least they're not digging them out of the local arsenic mine. The Victorian sweet shop was a kaleidoscope of colour and catastrophe, a rainbow you could eat and then tragically regret, because in the 1800s, the brighter the sweet, the closer you were to the light at the end of the tunnel. Now let's continue to ice cream. Victorian roulette with dairy. Ice cream, that cold, sweet symbol of childhood joy and summer delight. A dessert so wholesome, even the most hardened adult will melt just a little when handed a cone. But in Victorian Britain, ordering an ice cream cone didn't just mean a brain freeze. It meant a full-bodied gamble with death, diarrhea, and the chance to meet your maker with strawberry syrup still on your lips. Ice cream in the 19th century was both a luxury and a biological time bomb. It was the crown jewel of street snacks, adored by children, craved by adults, and peddled from grimy handcarts by men who had never once washed said hands. And yet, despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, it was wildly popular. Welcome to Victorian ice cream, where the thrill wasn't just in the taste, but in whether or not you'd survive the next 24 hours. In the absence of refrigeration as we know it, Victorian ice cream vendors had to get creative. The most common technique for keeping ice cream cold involved packing the tubs in salted ice, which could lower the temperature enough to keep the dairy semi-solid for a few hours. Where did the ice come from, you ask? Oh, only the most charming place in the world, the River Thames. Yes, the same Thames that flowed through the heart of a city, known for dumping everything into it. Human waste, dead animals, industrial runoff, and the occasional cholera-riddled corpse. Chunks of ice hacked from this fetid wonderland were collected, hauled through the city, stored in sawdust-insulated cellars, and eventually packed into wooden carts that also doubled as Victorian death traps on wheels. Your desserts chilled to perfection by the same water that dissolved your neighbor's cat. It's like a frozen treat with free bonus pathogens. Delicious. Pasteurization, heating milk to kill off bacteria, wouldn't be widely adopted until decades later. So the milk and cream used in Victorian ice cream were raw, unregulated, and often spoiled before they even got to the cart. There were no standard temperatures for storing dairy. No expiration dates. No inspectors. If the milk curdled, most vendors would simply add more sugar and serve it anyway. Because what's a little listeria among friends? Some dairy was watered down to stretch supplies, often with tap water that was more of a health hazard than a hydration source. In particularly dicey cases, it wasn't uncommon for cream to be freshened up by adding chalk, flour, or even plaster of Paris, because nothing screams summer treat like drywall in your dessert. Let's say the milk survived the microbial minefield, and your ice cream was, somehow, mostly edible. Don't relax yet, because now we get to the part where they tried to make it pretty, and dye was a whole new level of danger. Bright blue colouring wasn't made with blueberries or butterfly pea flowers. No, Victorian vendors often used Prussian blue, a vivid pigment that, fun fact, is derived from compounds containing cyanide. It wasn't just blue, either. Reds could be made with vermilion mercury-based, yellows with chrome yellow, hello again, lead chromate, and purples with a hodgepodge of questionable chemical cocktails no one fully understood. If you've ever wondered what it's like to consume a paint palette from an 1800s artist's studio, Victorian ice cream had you covered. Taste the rainbow, pray through the aftermath. Worried about what the ice cream was served in? Good news, there was no cone. That came later. Most ice cream was handed to customers in little glass cups or pewter pots, which were rarely, if ever, washed between uses. You'd eat your ice cream, hand the cup back, and the next kid in line would receive that same dish with the remnants of your saliva, and possibly your typhoid. Some vendors used tin molds which looked like adorable little fruits or shells. Adorable, that is, until you realized tin can leach into food, especially when exposed to acidic flavorings like lemon or berries. Enjoy your subtle metallic aftertaste and your bonus lead content. It's not cross-contamination, it's community bonding. Victorian newspapers occasionally ran public health warnings about ice cream poisoning, which caused symptoms ranging from stomach cramps to outright collapse. But despite its deadly reputation, ice cream never lost popularity. Why? Because it was cheap, cold, and for a brief, sugary moment, magical. For many working-class kids, a penny's worth of ice cream on a hot day was the closest they'd come to heaven. Fitting, since some of them actually went there afterward. Sure, it might end your life, but at least you'd die smiling with a frozen moustache. Victorian ice cream was more than a dessert. It was a test of courage, a gamble with mortality, and an early form of extreme sports for your intestines. You never knew if you were getting vanilla, with a side of dysentery. So next time you bite into your perfectly safe, FDA-approved, pasteurized ice cream sandwich, think of the brave souls of the 1800s, the kids who chased ice cream carts, not just for sweetness, but for the thrill of survival. In Victorian Britain, every scoop came with sprinkles, smiles, and a sudden drop in core temperature and immune system. Let's talk about meat pies, a warm, flaky, savory delight that in theory fills your belly and soothes your soul. Unless, of course, you were in Victorian Britain, in which case your pie could soothe your soul straight into the afterlife. These weren't your modern gastropub puff pastry delights, stuffed with slow-cooked brisket and portobello mushrooms. No, these were the pies of the people, dirt cheap, questionably hot, and stuffed with creatures that probably had names before they ended up under a crust. In Victorian cities, especially London, the meat pie wasn't just food, it was survival wrapped in pastry. Working-class men, women, and soot-faced street urchins depended on these handheld meals to get through long days in factories, workshops, or child labour adventures. But as affordable as they were, there was one small problem: nobody really knew what was in them. The meat pie vendor was a staple of the bustling street scene, with a soot-blackened cart and a loud bark. Hot pies. Fresh and meaty. These culinary cowboys roamed alleys and markets, hawking mysterious pockets of protein to anyone with a penny and a strong stomach. There were eel pies, pigeon pies, mutton pies, and sometimes just meat pies, the verbal equivalent of a shrug. The meat could be actual pigeon, or it could be pigeon adjacent, meaning rat, cat, or something that had once squeaked, meowed, or hissed near a sewer grate. If it had legs, moved too slowly, and was unlucky on a Tuesday, it could end up in a pie. Many vendors operated without licenses or oversight, meaning your street-side snack might have been prepared in someone's bathtub, stored next to boot polish, and cooked over a fire fueled by coal dust and despair. The 1800s were not big on ingredient transparency. There were no labels, no food inspectors, and no consumer protection agencies. If a pie tasted off, you might chalk it up to urban flavor, not food fraud. But fraud it most certainly was. Rat meat was frequently disguised as rabbit. It's astonishing how much the two resemble each other once minced and stewed beyond recognition. Cats, stray or otherwise, were also reportedly common inclusions. In fact, one enterprising vendor in Bethnal Green was caught with a backyard full of half-skinned cats and a cart full of beef pies that didn't pass the sniff test. Horse meat made frequent cameo appearances, especially from the overworked drays and carriage horses that collapsed in the streets. If they weren't carted off by the knackers, they might be repurposed, cooked up with onions and gravy, and served to the hungry masses under a buttery lid of plausible deniability. The only ingredient you could be sure of: regret. The Victorian meat pie was famously cheap, often just a penny or two, depending on the size and supposed contents. For the poor, that was a godsend. It was hot, filling, portable, and easier to chew than raw turnips or dreams, but cheapness came at a cost. Meat was often sourced from slaughterhouse scraps, or offcuts from butchers who wouldn't touch the stuff themselves. Think sinew, gristle, and whatever fell on the floor and got kicked under the table during processing. Organ meats were common too. Liver, kidney, and something suspiciously referred to as pluck, which could include lungs and whatever else could be scraped out of a carcass with a dull spoon. To mask the taste or the crime, vendors relied on aggressive seasoning. Salt, pepper, vinegar, and a suspiciously dark gravy were dumped in to hide foul smells or funky textures. Pies were then blasted in coal-fired ovens until the crust was practically armor-plated. Crispy outside, legally actionable inside. Food hygiene was theoretical at best. Meat was left unrefrigerated for hours or days, handled with bare hands, and sometimes refreshed with a quick rinse in the gutter. The risk of foodborne illness was sky-high. Botulism, salmonella, trichinosis, pick your parasite, you could collect the whole set. One particularly ghoulish issue was peppermint poisoning, a kind of foodborne illness caused by decaying protein. If your pie had that extra funky aroma, it wasn't blue cheese, it was decomposition. Many victims likely assumed they had a cold or a bad stomach bug. Few suspected that the culprit was the pigeon pie they devoured for lunch. In Victorian Britain, your meat pie came with filling and a farewell. Eventually, newspapers began picking up stories about mysterious meats and questionable vendors. Some offered cautionary tales like, "Don't eat the beef pie if it winks at you." Others printed exposés that showed pie vendors cooking in filthy basements, surrounded by animal skins, soot, and jars of special sauce that may have contained more secrets than flavor. Yet regulation was slow. Food adulteration laws were weak, poorly enforced, and riddled with loopholes. So the vendors kept selling, and the people kept eating. Because when it's between a mysterious meat pie and starvation, the gamble didn't feel like much of a choice. Victorian meat pies were a culinary Russian roulette, a hot, flaky crust, hiding an identity crisis. Every bite was a surprise, every chew a challenge to your gag reflex. But for millions of Victorians, it was survival food, a source of warmth in cold alleys, a belly filler between shifts at the mill, a hot meal when hot meals were rare. So next time you complain about the mystery meat in your cafeteria lunch, remember, at least it's probably not a recycled alley cat smothered in lard and lies. Victorian meat pies, the original don't read the ingredients meal. Now, you've worked 12 hours at a matchstick factory. Your lungs are full of phosphorus fumes. Your fingers are raw. Your spirit is broken. And your only dream is something cool, fizzy, and slightly sweet to cut through the coal dust in your throat. Enter Victorian ginger beer, the drink of the people, the working class's bubbly balm, and a glass-bottled gamble with gastrointestinal roulette. Yes, ginger beer was refreshing. Yes, it was tangy, spicy, zesty, and cheaper than tea. But it also had one teeny tiny flaw: it could kill you. By the mid-1800s, carbonated beverages were becoming the rage. Seltzer water, lemonade, root-based tonics, bubbly was in. And ginger beer? It was the trendsetter. With a kick from ginger, a dash of lemon, a bit of sugar, and a natural fermentation process that made it tingle on the tongue, it was the closest thing to soda pop the Victorians had. It even came in quaint little stone or glass bottles that looked almost fancy. But don't let the cute packaging fool you. These bottles were often reused, barely cleaned, and stored next to livestock, sewage drains, or the ever-reliable mold colony forming behind the fishmonger's stall. The result? A beverage that was 50% nostalgia, 50% bacteria, and 100% chaos. Victorian ginger beer tastes like childhood, ends like cholera. One of the biggest issues, the bottles themselves. In the Victorian era, there was no mass-scale bottle sanitation. Vendors or brewers collected used bottles, often from public dumps, gutters, or local pubs, and gave them a quick rinse, which might mean a dunk in cold water, a swish of rainwater, or, if you were lucky, a wipe with someone's apron. No soap, no sterilization. Definitely no modern hygiene standards. Even worse, many reused porous stoneware bottles, lovely for presentation, but ideal hiding places for bacteria and fungi. A bottle used for pickled herring the week before might become your vessel for fizzy ginger delight. And you'd never know, because the fizz and sugar masked the aroma of doom. Some bottles even exploded, due to poor fermentation control. Overactive yeast and sealed containers made for volatile combinations. It wasn't uncommon to hear the pop of a bottle in a street stall and assume it was either ginger beer or a small cannon misfiring. In Victorian London, it wasn't the gun that got you, it was the ginger beer bottle. The ingredients weren't always pure, either. Sure, good ginger beer had fresh ginger, lemon, and sugar, but good ingredients cost money, so cost-cutting began. Some brewers used sulfuric acid to simulate sharpness. Others swapped real lemon for lemon coloring and citric acid, sometimes derived from rotting citrus peels. And the water? Well, let's just say that most of London's water supply was as fresh as a horse trough on a summer afternoon. One infamous case in 1852 involved a batch brewed using water from a well contaminated by a rotting rat and a pile of dead insects. The result? A fleet of food poisoning cases so violent that newspapers dubbed it the ginger beer incident. Dozens hospitalized, a few fatalities. Several folks may have hallucinated the ghost of the rat that brewed it all, now with notes of cinnamon, lemon, and vague despair. If the water didn't get you, the bottle surprise might. Consumers routinely found floating black specks, stringy fungal growths, and even worms in their drink. Some chalked it up to sediment, Others assumed it was part of the fermentation process. After all, science was confusing, and drinks were lumpy sometimes. Right. Wrong. What they were drinking wasn't complex texture. It was microbial warfare, mold spores, thriving yeast, or little critters that crawled in during bottling made every sip a potential encounter with nature's worst. And if someone complained, the vendor would shrug and say, "That's just the real stuff. Good for the constitution." Eventually, Victorian authorities began to notice that people were vomiting violently after their ginger beer. That, and the occasional coroner's inquest over a fizzy beverage, led to the introduction of early food safety laws. One of the most pivotal cases was the Donahue v. Stevenson lawsuit in 1932, a full 80 years later, which famously involved a woman who found a dead snail in her ginger beer bottle. This case laid the foundation for modern product liability law and finally made beverage manufacturers more accountable. Unfortunately, for most of the Victorian era, you were on your own. If you survived a bottle of ginger beer, you toasted your immune system and hoped for the best. If you didn't, well, your tombstone might read, "Here lies Timmy, loved sugar, died bubbly." Ginger beer was supposed to be a treat, a bright spot in the soot-coloured existence of 19th century city life, a zippy drink for coal-stained hands and overworked bodies. Instead, it often became an unlabeled chemical experiment, a gamble on fermentation, and a monument to the phrase, "Well, it can't be worse than the water." So next time you sip your modern ginger beer from a chilled, sealed can, just remember, you're enjoying a luxury that once involved fungus, glass shrapnel, rodent broth, and a lot of prayers. Victorian ginger beer, refreshingly unpredictable, regrettably lethal. Now close your eyes and imagine a warm Victorian kitchen, fresh bread on the table, a fluffy sponge cake cooling on the sill, maybe a bit of sugar sprinkled on top. Lovely, right? Now imagine that bread is bulked out with plaster, the milk was watered down and whitened with chalk, the sugar is mixed with crushed stone, and that fluffy sponge cake, structurally indistinguishable from ceiling grout. Welcome to Adulteration Nation, where every bite was a leap of faith and nutritional value was just a rumour. The Victorian food market was basically the Wild West, if the Wild West had less gunfights and more powdered gypsum in your biscuits. With no formal health codes, quality standards, or routine inspections, vendors realized they could pad profits by stretching ingredients. And stretch they did with anything that looked vaguely like the real deal and didn't scream poison right away. Let's say you were a baker. You needed flour, but flour was expensive. So what if, hypothetically, you added plaster of Paris? It's white, it's powdery, and it bulks things up nicely. Sure, it's used for setting bones and building walls, but who's going to notice? Victorian baking, part breakfast, part home improvement project. Milk was another hot target. Fresh milk spoiled quickly. So dishonest vendors made two tweaks. Dilute it with water, sometimes taken from questionable sources, red puddles. Add chalk or whitening agents to make it look fresh again. Some milk served to city kids was barely dairy and more like a soup of chalk dust and lies. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, other additives included starch, flour, and even animal brains, used to thicken or enrich spoiled milk to extend shelf life, which in Victorian times meant hopefully doesn't kill before tea time. Sugar wasn't safe either. It was expensive and white, so vendors cut it with things like powdered limestone, crushed marble dust, finely ground sand. Yes, sand. Victorian citizens were unknowingly exfoliating their teeth from the inside. Sweet treats often came with a subtle grit, like chewing on a beach vacation, but customers were so used to the texture that some even considered it normal. If you didn't crunch when you chewed, was it even authentic? Even innocent things, like pepper and mustard powder, were fair game. A sample analysis of black pepper in the 1850s found it was often just ground-up burnt bread or linseed meal, mixed with colouring agents. Mustard, commonly adulterated with turmeric substitutes and lead chromate. Yep, the same stuff that made candy glow like radioactive sunshine. Cayenne pepper, occasionally boosted with red lead, which provided heat, just not the kind that stays in your mouth, more like the kind that leads to neurological failure. But as long as it looked spicy and didn't immediately drop you, it stayed on shelves. Bread was the Victorian staple, And yet, surprise, also a minefield. Beyond the flour and plaster combo, bakers used alum to bleach bread white, a process that also disrupted digestion. Clay and whitening agents to simulate purity, boiled bones to bulk up dough. Sometimes the bread was so light and white it almost glowed, a marvel of modern chemistry. But your stomach didn't care about visual appeal. It just wanted to not be sandblasted from within. Victorian bread looks like a cloud, chews like a chalkboard eraser. Even beverages weren't spared. Beer could be adulterated with tobacco juice for bitterness or iron sulfate to make it look rich and strong. Wine was routinely stretched with wood alcohol or fortified with metallic salts to deepen the color. Lemonade was sometimes citric acid and sugar water dyed with yellow paint flakes. If it fizzed, colored your tongue or burned slightly going down, that just meant it was working. Fortunately, all this horror eventually caught someone's attention. Chemists like Arthur Hill Hassall began running tests on street food, drinks, and store goods. What they found was so alarming that newspapers began publishing name and shame lists of the worst offenders. This growing scandal led to the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, the first of many baby steps toward food safety laws. But enforcement was weak. You could still walk into a shop in 1870 and buy flour that came with a side of masonry grit and not even blink. It wasn't until well into the 20th century that food regulation became strong enough to keep your breakfast from doubling as a construction material sampler. Stretching ingredients in the Victorian era wasn't just a little scam, it was a national pastime. An entire generation grew up biting into bread that fought back, drinking milk that doubled as a chalkboard cleaner, and sweetening tea with minerals better suited to aquarium gravel. Yet people just accepted it. Because what choice did they have? So next time you bite into a soft, warm sponge cake made with actual eggs and zero drywall filler, just pause to be grateful that today's ingredient list doesn't include an alibi. Victorian food, deliciously deceptive, deceptively deadly. Honestly, how did anyone survive Victorian junk food? Between the arsenic bonbons, sand sugar scones, and ginger beer that doubled as a biohazard, eating in 19th century, Britain wasn't so much nourishment as it was an extreme sport, a gamble, a test of constitution, blind faith, and very sturdy stomach linings. And yet somehow, against all odds, and several types of heavy metal, people did survive. Some even thrived, probably because they had no idea what they were eating. Because in Victorian England, the question wasn't, is this safe? It was, how many pennies do I have? And will this still be warm by the time I catch a chimney sweep to school? To modern sensibilities, Victorian street food sounds like something out of a dystopian survival novel. But for the working class, it was a daily reality. Most people didn't have the luxury of full kitchens, let alone fresh ingredients. Meals were eaten on the go, often bought from carts, alleys, or a man named something like Greasy Bill, who sold meat pies out of his coat. Your dinner might have been rat-adjacent, your dessert might have glowed in the dark, and your beverage might have doubled as paint thinner. But hey, at least it was cheap. Food wasn't about indulgence or nutrition. It was about not passing out before your next 14-hour factory shift. Kids were especially vulnerable to this chaos. Their immune systems, still under construction. Their taste in snacks, zero standards. If it sparkled, cracked, fizzed, or made their tongues change color, it was fair game. Candy vendors knew this. They weren't selling safe or approved products. They were selling wonder, mystery, pure, unregulated delight. Who needs calcium when you can have mercury-flavored raspberry drops or self-shattering sugar sticks dipped in questionable food dye? For children in soot-stained caps, a penny sweet wasn't just candy. It was escape. It was joy. It was a break from coal dust and discipline, even if it was slowly killing them from the inside. Childhood wasn't measured in years. It was measured in how many lead candies you could survive. Part of the chaos came from the era's obsession with science and industrial progress. New dyes, new powders, new preservatives, all promising to improve food shelf life and appearance. But no one stopped to ask, should we be eating this? If a chemical made your cake brighter, your beer fizzier, or your mustard yellower, it went in the recipe. And without federal regulations, the phrase buyer beware took on a disturbingly literal meaning. The result was a world where bread could double as building material, milk was half water and half chalk, and your cough drops might contain heroin, but not enough to be fun, just enough to make you forget your stomach cramps. By the late 19th century, enough people had died or become mysteriously ill from snacks that society finally raised its collective eyebrow. The rise of analytical chemistry and a few particularly appalled scientists brought public awareness to the horrors of adulterated food. Campaigns were launched, laws were passed, reforms began. Slowly, very slowly, food got less deadly, but the transition wasn't immediate, and for many Victorians, these dangerous delights remained the only accessible option. Until then, the poor just had to rely on grit, luck, and the occasional prayer that their pastry didn't contain formaldehyde. Despite it all, Victorian society marched on. Children grew up, teeth fell out, recipes changed, vendors adapted, people kept eating. Why? Because that's what people do. We take what we can get, find moments of sweetness in the chaos, and teach ourselves to crave the familiar, even if it's dusted in arsenic. There's something both tragic and oddly endearing about the era's snacks. They weren't just food, they were tiny triumphs of ingenuity, survival, and hope. A penny sweet was a brief burst of pleasure in a world full of soot, sickness, and strict social rules. It wasn't about nutrition, it was about survival with sprinkles. So next time you stress about whether your yogurt is organic enough, or whether your granola bar is gluten-free, spare a moment for our Victorian ancestors, who would have traded 3 siblings for a spoonful of pasteurized ice cream. Because the truth is, we've come a long way. Food is safer, labels exist, chalk belongs on sidewalks, not in milk, and arsenic is, for the most part, no longer a topping. But the spirit of those dangerous delicacies lives on, in every neon-coloured snack, every questionable vending machine mystery, and every child still drawn to the weirdest, stickiest treat on the shelf. Victorian junk food was wild, reckless, and occasionally fatal, but it was also unforgettable, and in a strange, sugar-coated way, it helped shape the world of snacks we know today. Welcome to Egypt, where the sun is merciless, the sand is everywhere, and the buildings are triangles for some reason. It's the early 1800s. Europeans are going through an ancient Egypt phase harder than a teenager discovering astrology. They've just realized, hey, those big pointy things in the desert, not just sand piles, they're pyramids. Giant, mathematically perfect structures filled with chambers, traps, and very possibly curses. And suddenly everyone with a monocle wants to get inside. Enter the explorers. Think Indiana Jones, but with worse hygiene, fewer morals, and a tendency to accidentally destroy priceless artifacts in the name of science. Some came with notebooks, others came with dynamite, and spoiler alert, the dynamite guys got in faster, but the notebooks lasted longer. These early archaeologists, and I use that term the way you'd call a raccoon a chef for opening a trash can, descended into the pyramids with a single goal: loot. Discover. Everything the ancients left behind. What did they find? Rooms so cramped you had to crawl like a toddler in a tunnel made of limestone. Air so stale it smelled like regret and 1,000-year-old pharaoh breath. Booby traps? Not really. Unless you count the psychological trap of realizing you're crawling 100 feet underground, in the dark, with no backup plan, and something just moved behind you. And the hieroglyphs? Oh, the walls were covered in them. Elegant carvings telling stories of gods, kings, and very possibly the ancient Egyptian version of passive-aggressive post-it notes. Fun fact, early explorers couldn't read hieroglyphs yet, so they'd stare at these elaborate symbols and go, ah yes, clearly this means something terrifying, probably a death curse. Let's take it home and put it in a museum, because nothing says, please don't haunt me, like stealing a sacred sarcophagus and shipping it across the ocean. And we haven't even mentioned the locals yet. Imagine living next to the pyramids your whole life, watching Europeans show up, poke around sacred burial chambers with sticks, and then claim they discovered it. It's like someone walking into your grandma's house, kicking the door down, and yelling, look what I found. So, what even are the pyramids? Imagine building a skyscraper using nothing but rope, rocks, and intense peer pressure. Welcome to Giza. It's hot. The kind of hot where even your thoughts start sweating. The air shimmers with heat, camels blink judgmentally at you, and in the distance rise three impossibly large triangles stabbing into the sky like ancient middle fingers to gravity. Congratulations, you're looking at the pyramids. The pyramids are old, and I don't mean your uncle still uses a flip phone. Old. I mean older than the concept of old. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the biggest, boldest, and most don't you dare touch that, of the trio was built around 2560 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. To put that in perspective, when Cleopatra was alive, the Great Pyramid was already ancient to her. That's like someone today admiring the ruins of the first fax machine and calling it prehistoric. And these aren't little backyard garden pyramids either. The Great Pyramid was originally 481 feet tall, making it the tallest man-made structure in the world for over 3,800 years. That's longer than any other building has held the record since. The next tallest building to top it, a cathedral in England, in the 1300s, and it only beat the pyramid by like a pointy hat's worth. Now, let's talk construction, or more specifically, how the actual pharaoh-shaped heck did people without power tools, cranes or OSHA safety protocols manage to stack 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons, into a mathematically perfect structure? No one knows. That's right. Not even modern engineers can fully agree on how it was done. Some theories say ramps, others say levers, a few say aliens. But those people also think the moon landing was filmed in a pyramid basement. Either way, it was likely thousands of workers, not slaves, but actually paid laborers. Egypt wasn't always awful, hauling rocks using copper tools, and being yelled at by foremen in leopard print kilts. And oh yes, math. These ancient builders weren't just stacking stones like a kid with blocks. The pyramid's base is nearly a perfect square, and each side aligns almost exactly with the 4 cardinal directions. The entire structure is aligned to true north, with more precision than modern compasses could manage, until fairly recently. Which begs the question, how did a civilization that thought hippos were divine manage such geometric wizardry? Some think they used the stars, others think they used shadows. Either way, they didn't just build big triangles, they built the single most precisely engineered piles of rock in human history. And they did it without spreadsheets. Now fast forward 4,500 years. The pyramids are still standing. Think about that. These giant million-ton megastructures have survived earthquakes, sandstorms, looters, Napoleon's cannons, and generations of European tourists who thought it was cool to chip off souvenirs. Yet somehow, they're still here, like history's most patient introverts, quietly judging the chaos of the modern world. And yes, sand, so much sand. The desert has tried its best to bury them, one gust at a time, but the pyramids just shrug it off like an ancient diva, refusing to fade out of the spotlight. Structurally, the pyramid design isn't just for show. The shape helps distribute weight evenly, which is why these things haven't collapsed like every other great idea in human history. It's basically the most efficient form for eternal stone bragging, which makes sense, because Pharaoh Khufu wasn't building a house, he was building a monument that screamed, "Look upon my works, you mighty in despair." Also, leave snacks for the afterlife. And if you're wondering, yes, the other 2 pyramids belong to Khafre Khufu's son and Menkaure, his grandson. It's like a family tradition, but instead of passing down heirlooms, they just pass down the blueprints for cosmic real estate. So what even are the pyramids? They're tombs, yes, but they're also statements. Loud, proud, mathematically precise death flexes built with back-breaking labor, a disturbingly advanced understanding of geometry, and the unshakable belief that the gods really, really liked triangles, and they still stand. Long after the empires fell, the invasions happened, and the dust tried to win. They're still there, silently watching tourists stumble around in cargo shorts, snapping selfies with 4,500-year-old rocks like they're visiting the world's most judgmental grandma. So next time you glance at the pyramids and think, wow, those are big, just remember those are also impossibly old, mathematically absurd, and way more durable than your iPhone. Pharaohs, tombs, and ancient Egyptian extraness, because nothing says rest in peace like a booby-trapped hallway and a mountain of gold. Let's get one thing straight. Pharaohs were not humble people. These were not the quiet quitting type. No, pharaohs were living gods, crowned with enough eyeliner to qualify for a modern rock band, and surrounded by more opulence than a Vegas hotel lobby. And when they died, oh, they didn't just get a coffin and a headstone. They got a pyramid, a megastructure designed to scream, "I'm rich, dead, and probably still in charge." So why pyramids? Were they just flexing on the neighbors? Kind of. But more than that. Pyramids were celestial launch pads, symbolic staircases meant to help the pharaoh's soul ascend to the heavens. You see, ancient Egyptians didn't just hope there was an afterlife. They built it into their entire infrastructure. They believed in a vibrant, judgment-packed afterlife, filled with gods, tests, feasts, and possibly crocodiles. And to survive this cosmic game show, pharaohs needed preparation, not just thoughts and prayers, but the full deluxe burial package. That meant a sarcophagus, heavier than your car walls, carved with mystical instruction manuals, enough gold to bankrupt a small kingdom, and yes, the occasional death trap, because what is eternity without a little high-stakes booby-trapping? Each pyramid was a customized spiritual security system. You didn't just walk into a pharaoh's final resting place. You got lost in it, cursed by it, and possibly crushed by a sliding stone the size of a refrigerator. That's not accidental. Ancient Egyptians designed these tombs like puzzles, complete with false passages, hidden chambers, and oops, that's a dead end full of scorpions, surprises. The idea? Confuse grave robbers, protect the body, keep the soul comfy. Because in Egyptian theology, you needed your body to stay intact for your spirit to survive in the afterlife. And that's where things get, well, mummified. Ah yes, mummification. Egypt's most iconic method of turning a corpse into a stylish raisin. The process wasn't fast, cheap, or even remotely pleasant. Step 1. Remove all the organs. Step 2. Stuff the body with salt, natrum, specifically. Step 3. Wrap the whole thing in yards of linen, like a designer burrito. Bonus steps included inserting amulets for spiritual Wi-Fi and placing a scarab beetle over the heart, which was believed to keep it from confessing any embarrassing secrets during the afterlife's final exam. And those organs, they didn't just get tossed. They were each carefully stored in canopic jars, cute little containers with animal-headed lids. One for the liver, one for the stomach, one for the intestines, and one for the lungs. The brain, that was yanked out through the nose with a hook and thrown away. Apparently, your thoughts were irrelevant in the afterlife. Relatable. But why go through all this effort? Simple. If the pharaoh passed the test in the afterlife, known as the weighing of the heart, he got to hang out with Osiris in the eternal paradise of the Field of Reeds, where the crops were always perfect, the Nile never flooded your sandals, and probably no one asked you to fill out forms. This heart-weighing ceremony was the original Judgment Day. Your heart was placed on a scale against the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth and justice. Too heavy with sin, you were devoured by a terrifying chimera named Amit, part lion, part hippo, part crocodile, and all-around nightmare fuel. Pharaohs weren't just building tombs, they were building spiritual resumes, and this is where the extraness really kicks in. Because it wasn't just pharaohs being embalmed and pampered, their pets, their servants, and sometimes entire miniature armies were prepped and packed into the tomb with them. Imagine being told your job included eternal unemployment in a pyramid. Congrats, you're going to spend the next forever fanning the pharaoh's ghost. Hope you like sand. Of course, none of this would be complete without a good curse or two. Egyptians didn't actually write, "You shall die if you open this" on every wall, but they certainly leaned into ominous phrasing. Some tomb inscriptions warned of divine retribution, scorpions of the underworld, and other threats that might have made future looters pause, or at least bring gloves. To modernize, these rituals may seem extreme. An entire nation of engineers, artists, priests, and embalmers mobilized for one man's death. But to the Egyptians, death wasn't the end. It was just a really bureaucratic beginning, and the pyramid was their cosmic passport office. So next time you see a pyramid, remember, it's not just a triangle made of stone. It's a divine launch pad, a trap-laden treasure vault, and a massive spiritual to-do list, all rolled into one. Because when it came to dying, the pharaohs didn't just go big, they went immortal. Now, here's a fun riddle. What's giant, made of stone, visible for miles, and still somehow went missing? That's right, the The pyramids, specifically the world-famous Great Pyramids of Giza, which spent centuries just kind of sitting there, not hiding, not buried, just chilling in the desert being, visibly enormous. And yet, for hundreds of years, a large chunk of the world, especially medieval Europe, basically acted like they didn't exist. Let's be clear, the pyramids were never physically lost. They didn't sink into the sand like Atlantis, or hide behind a very large camel. People living near them, Egyptians, Bedouins, random goats, always knew they were there. What got lost was the context, the why, the how, the who, and the very purpose of these monolithic wonders were gradually swallowed by time, sand, and an impressive level of collective forgetfulness. The root of this historical blackout, welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when Europe was a little too busy with plagues, inquisitions and jousting-related head trauma to worry about North African stone architecture. By this point, the Roman Empire had fallen, trade routes had collapsed, and the cultural hotline between Egypt and Europe was officially disconnected. Ancient Greek and Roman writings about Egypt still existed, sure, but only in dusty libraries no one read, unless they were really into scrolls and mold. So what did people in medieval Europe think the pyramids were? Well, depending on who you asked, they were giant grain silos built by Joseph, from the Bible, random heaps of rock, tombs of biblical giants, demonic structures built by sorcery, or possibly ancient bathrooms for very tall people. Okay, maybe not officially, but let's be honest, someone probably guessed that. This all sounds ridiculous until you remember without hieroglyphs, dating methods, or the internet. Europeans had zero real context. The ancient Egyptian language had long since died out. Hieroglyphs were seen as magical squiggles from another realm, and pharaoh names like Khufu or Sneferu meant nothing to people who thought the world was 6,000 years old and shaped like a divine pizza. Even Arabic-speaking scholars who lived closer to the pyramids were often working with third-hand legends and educated guesses. Medieval Islamic historians like al-Masudi and al-Idrisi tried to understand the pyramids' purpose, but they often blended ancient Egyptian myth with Islamic theology and whatever local rumor the nearest camel herder happened to mention. One persistent legend claimed the pyramids were filled with treasure, so naturally, various caliphs, warlords, and curious opportunists tried to crack them open like ancient piñatas. The most infamous was Caliph al-Mamun in the 9th century, who couldn't figure out how to get into the Great Pyramid like a normal person. So he allegedly just started digging into it sideways until he found a chamber and called it a day. He didn't find treasure, by the way, just empty rooms and existential disappointment. But here's where it gets wild. Even the locations of some pyramids began to blur in the public mind. While the Great Pyramids of Giza stayed famous in some circles, lesser-known pyramids, like those at Saqqara or Darsha, basically faded into myth or rumor, especially if they were half-buried or decaying. Over time they were looted, stripped for building materials, or simply ignored, like last year's papyrus tax records. By the 15th and 16th centuries, European cartographers and explorers started poking around again, but their interpretations were imaginative, to say the least. Some maps mislabeled the pyramids as natural hills. Others suggested they were the tombs of kings who lived before the flood, as if Noah's Ark had a VIP passenger list that included guys with stone megastructures. It wasn't until the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798 that a group of French scholars began documenting the pyramids systematically. Napoleon may have failed militarily, but his nerd squad, the savants, brought measuring tools, sketchbooks, and just enough ego to believe they could decipher a civilization. They couldn't read hieroglyphs yet, but they finally gave the pyramids their due as marvels of engineering, not giant biblical cereal bins. Meanwhile, back in Europe, knowledge was slowly being rediscovered thanks to Arabic translations of older Greek texts, travelers' reports, and people who just really liked staring at triangles. And when Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the Rosetta Stone in the 1820s, unlocking the language of hieroglyphs, the ancient world opened up like a particularly dusty pop-up book. So to summarize, for nearly 1,000 years, the pyramids were like the world's biggest celebrity, with no publicist. Always there, always photogenic, but completely misunderstood. It wasn't malicious ignorance. It was just the slow erosion of knowledge over centuries, helped along by sandstorms, broken empires, and a medieval preference for dragons over documentation. Next time someone tells you people in the past were just as smart as us, remind them that a whole continent managed to forget. The pyramids weren't grain silos. They had one job. By the late 18th century, Europe was in full Enlightenment mode. People were reading encyclopedias, drawing diagrams of insects, and finally admitting that maybe the Earth wasn't flat after all. Into this age of wigs and scientific curiosity marched Napoleon Bonaparte, a man best known for conquering everything and overcompensating for his height, which, by the way, wasn't even that short. It was just French inches. Long story. In 1798, Napoleon decided to invade Egypt. Why? Well, partially to stick it to Britain by cutting off its trade routes to India, and partially because Napoleon had a thing for exotic lands, grand gestures, and sunstroke. But what makes this invasion unique and weirdly wholesome is that Napoleon didn't just bring soldiers and cannons, he brought nerds. Yes, really. In addition to 35,000 troops, Napoleon brought along around 160 scholars, scientists, artists and engineers, collectively known as the savants. This was possibly the only time in history that a military expedition included mathematicians, botanists, architects, and guys whose entire job was to draw beetles really accurately. These were the Avengers of academia, ready to take on the mysteries of Egypt, with rulers, notebooks, and way too much excitement over statues. And this wasn't just a gimmick. Napoleon genuinely believed in the power of science and knowledge, so much so that he gave the savants official uniforms, set up laboratories, and even published a newspaper in the middle of the desert. Because if you're going to invade a country, you might as well print the newsletter yourself. These scholars set out to document everything. Every temple, every ruin, every hieroglyph they couldn't read, but assumed was important. They sketched it, measured it, and argued about it, in long dusty debates under the Egyptian sun. Locals must have thought, who are these Frenchmen poking statues with sticks and squealing over sphinxes? Their efforts culminated in one of the most ambitious publications of the time, the Description de l'Egypte. This multi-volume monster was part encyclopedia, part travelogue, and part love letter to ancient Egyptian civilization. It included detailed drawings of pyramids, maps of archaeological sites, notes on mummification, diagrams of ancient tools, and the occasional confused speculation like, this falcon-headed statue was probably a priest, or maybe a god, or an angry chicken. Now, let's not give Napoleon too much credit. This was still a military invasion, complete with cannonballs, colonial ambition, and some very confused camels. The French clashed with local Mamluk forces, British ships, and eventually malaria. At one point, Napoleon even abandoned his army and slipped back to France like a general who suddenly remembered he left the stove on. But despite the military failure, the cultural and scientific impact was massive. Napoleon's Egypt expedition kick-started modern Egyptology. It brought Egypt back into the European consciousness, not just as a biblical footnote or a backdrop for pyramid-shaped pastry designs, but as a complex ancient civilization that demanded study, and maybe a few thousand museum thefts later. We'll get to that in a later chapter. Oh, and while Napoleon's scholars were busy writing books, one of his soldiers accidentally stumbled upon the Rosetta Stone near the town of Rosetta, modern-day Rashid. That slab of granodiorite, inscribed with the same message in Greek, Demotic, and ancient Egyptian, would become the key to deciphering hieroglyphs decades later. So yes, Napoleon technically didn't find the Rosetta Stone himself, but he gets partial credit for bringing a curious army to the right place at the right time, with the right amount of unintentional historical significance. There's also something deeply symbolic about this moment. A short, ambitious man with dreams of empire standing in front of the enormous ruins of a long-dead empire, trying to make sense of it all. You could almost hear the pyramids whispering, "Nice try, buddy." And while some critics scoffed at the scholarly baggage Napoleon brought along, calling it unnecessary, extravagant, or downright weird, his decision forever changed how we explore history. Before 1798, archaeology was basically looting with extra steps. After 1798, it started to resemble a real discipline, with measurements, methods, and men in monocles arguing over pottery shards. So to summarize, Napoleon came to Egypt with cannons, but he left a legacy of cataloguing curiosity and accidental breakthroughs. His soldiers may not have conquered Egypt, but his scientists helped the world rediscover it. One sketch, sand-blasted monument, and mysterious cat statue at a time. And yes, Napoleon did lose Egypt, but he gained a spot in the most unexpected of halls of fame, the one where people say, you know what, that conqueror really cared about ancient pottery. By the 1800s, ancient Egypt had re-entered the European imagination, like an old celebrity no one remembered until someone dug up their golden bling and skeleton. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the action, preferably a literal piece, like a statue, sarcophagus, or mummy hand. This was the golden age of tomb raiding, disguised, very poorly, as early archaeology. Picture this, a time before historical preservation laws, museum ethics, or even a basic understanding of how sand works. Into this dusty playground stumbled a colourful cast of adventurers, eccentrics, and overly enthusiastic dilettantes. These weren't patient scholars, these were sledgehammer scholars, armed with dynamite, questionable fashion choices, and egos larger than the pyramids they were trying to loot. And leading this parade of polite destruction was a man named Giovanni Battista Belzoni, also known as the Great Belzoni. He was a former circus strongman, hydraulic engineer, and part-time demolition enthusiast who decided one day, hey, why not pivot to ancient tombs? Belzoni wasn't just a man. He was an entire demolition crew stuffed into one Italian adventurer. Standing at 6'7", he was built like a myth and behaved like a Victorian action hero, with zero chill. His approach to archaeology was, let's call it, enthusiastic destruction. If something stood in his way, he didn't study it, he moved it, cracked it, or blew it up. In 1817, Belzoni pulled off one of his most infamous feats, hauling the colossal 7-ton bust of Ramses II out of the Ramesseum in Thebes and shipping it to England. The process involved ropes, grease, brute force, a wooden sled, and the unshakable belief that physics will eventually give up if you're stubborn enough. He succeeded. The bust now lives in the British Museum, where it silently judges visitors and possibly still holds a grudge. Belzoni's other accomplishments include being the first European to enter the Pyramid of Khafre, discovering several tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and almost dying repeatedly because he confused ancient ventilation shaft with invitation to crawl blindly through bat-infested tunnels. And here's the kicker. He kept a diary. It reads like a fever dream of a man who's half explorer, half blunt object. He writes about collapsing ceilings, collapsing lungs from dust, and collapsing friendships with fellow looters who were stealing his thunder, and sometimes his artifacts. But Belzoni wasn't alone. The 1800s were filled with similar characters. Howard Vyse, a British officer who discovered chambers in the Great Pyramid by blasting them open with gunpowder. Nothing screams careful examination like lighting a fuse in a 4000-year-old monument. Carl Richard Lepsius, a Prussian Egyptologist with more finesse, but still plenty of that 19th century finders-keepers energy, and a swarm of lesser-known collectors, grave robbers, and bored aristocrats who treated Egypt like a giant antique mall, except everything in the mall was sacred, cursed, or already falling apart. Back then, you could walk into a tomb, grab a few mummies, and ship them back to London like they were garden gnomes. In fact, mummy powder became a trend. People literally ground up mummies and ate them, or used them in paint. Yes, nothing brings out the Renaissance glow like Pharaoh in your face cream. Even worse were the mummy unwrapping parties in England and France, social events where mummies were theatrically unwrapped in front of curious dinner guests. Picture an 1800s TED Talk meets horror show, with people sipping tea while someone peels 3,000-year-old linen off a corpse like it's a historical banana. This was the era before carbon dating, before archaeology degrees, and before museum ethics commissions. The guiding principle was simple. If it looks cool and you can carry it, it's yours. Ancient sites were looted with the enthusiasm of a Black Friday sale, and many artifacts were permanently separated from their context, their inscriptions, and sometimes their heads. And yet, this chaos did accidentally help spark public fascination with ancient Egypt. The sheer spectacle of it all, the massive statues being dragged across deserts, the headlines about tombs and curses, the random obelisks popping up in Paris and New York, turned Egypt from a dusty footnote into a global obsession. Sadly, it came at the cost of priceless knowledge and a fair bit of cultural dignity. So when we talk about archaeology in the 1800s, let's be honest, It was less Indiana Jones and more Looney Tunes with powdered wigs. A time when explorers treated tombs like piñatas, and museums were just rich people's closets filled with things they didn't understand, but liked to brag about. Next time you walk through a museum and see an ancient artifact, just remember, it might have survived dynasties, earthquakes, and millennia of shifting sand. But its biggest challenge was surviving a Victorian with a mustache and a crowbar. If you ever feel like your job is dangerous, spare a thought for the early 20th century archaeologists who risked suffocation, fungal infections, and spontaneous supernatural vengeance, all while crawling through dark, ancient tunnels that smelled like Pharaoh-flavored mildew. Welcome to the world of pyramid exploration, where the biggest threat wasn't always collapsing ceilings or poor hygiene. It was bad air, bad luck, and a public obsessed with ancient curses. Let's set the scene. It's 1922, and a British archaeologist named Howard Carter is poking around the Valley of the Kings, convinced there's still one last untouched royal tomb hiding in the sand, against the odds, and his patron's rapidly thinning patience. He finds it the tomb of Tutankhamun, a sealed, treasure-packed time capsule, and within days of opening it, people start dying. First up, Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy backer of the dig, who sliced open a mosquito bite on his face while shaving. The wound became infected, and he died not long after. Rumours quickly flew faster than a desert locust swarm. The curse of the pharaoh. Newspapers ran wild. Carter's pet canary was eaten by a cobra. Lights flickered. People whispered that opening tombs had awakened ancient revenge. In reality, the curse was more PR campaign than paranormal. Egyptian tomb curses were often real, but not in the lightning bolt from the heavens way. They were written on the walls, meant to scare off looters, with threats like death will come on swift wings, or may the crocodile eat your soul if you touch my sarcophagus. Basically the ancient version of no trespassing. Violators will be cursed and devoured. But the Victorians, and later, the 1920s media, ate that up like it was ancient popcorn. After all, what's more exciting than a mummy? A vengeful mummy. You can thank this era for every Pharaoh's curse movie plot, Halloween costume, and cartoon, where the mummy walks like it desperately needs a chiropractor. Still, some tomb explorers did die mysteriously, and that's where science crashes the party, wearing its glasses and holding a petri dish. Because it turns out that sealed tombs, those untouched for thousands of years, aren't exactly OSHA compliant. Imagine opening a room that hasn't seen fresh air since Cleopatra had a tan. Inside, dust, mold, bat guano, spores, ancient bacteria. Basically a haunted house, built by a microbiologist. Scientists later discovered that many tombs contained Aspergillus flavus, a fungus that produces deadly mycotoxins. Breathe enough of that in, and you're not cursed, you're infected. There were also toxic nitrogen compounds, carbon dioxide buildups, and even the risk of mummification chemicals, like formaldehyde or resin, breaking down into something you should definitely not inhale. Not to mention, early archaeologists did all this with no protective gear. Their PPE consisted of optimism, a mustache, and maybe a cotton scarf. And then there were the cramped crawl spaces. Most of these tombs weren't built for comfort. They were meant to keep out tomb robbers, not welcome curious European men with measuring sticks and dreams of museum glory. That meant long, narrow shafts, steep descending tunnels, hidden chambers, and the occasional drop-off into eternal darkness. Architectural feature. Imagine army crawling through a pitch-black corridor, barely wide enough for your ribs, carrying a flickering lantern, all while the stale air smells like a mixture of dead beetle and ancient despair. Also, scorpions. And sometimes, bats. One explorer described the feeling of tomb exploration as like crawling into the throat of a sleeping god, one who had skipped dental hygiene for 3 millennia. But back to the curse. One of the juiciest myths to emerge was that Tutankhamun's tomb had an inscription warning intruders of doom. Spoiler, it didn't. No such curse was ever found in his burial chambers. But the myth persisted, because reality couldn't compete with a good story involving mummies, retribution, and maybe a ghostly whisper echoing through the limestone. Interestingly, Howard Carter, the man who opened the tomb, never died of the curse. He lived for over a decade afterward, outliving many of the other expedition members. If there was a curse, it apparently took weekends off, and had a flexible schedule. Ultimately, the idea of mummy curses says more about us than it does about the ancient Egyptians. It reflects our mix of awe, guilt, superstition, and let's be honest, a desperate need for things to be more dramatic than they are. Explorer dies of lung fungus doesn't sell newspapers quite like King's wrath reaches beyond the grave. So yes, breathing in mummy mold is bad for you. So is crawling through tombs that double as biohazard chambers. But the real horror, the sheer number of people who thought it was a good idea to do this in leather shoes and tweed jackets, and call it a field study. Next time you hear someone brag about surviving an ancient curse, just nod, and maybe check if they're coughing up sarcophagus spores. So picture this. You're standing in front of an ancient Egyptian temple. On the walls, there's a sea of strange symbols. Eyes, snakes, reeds, ankhs, birds, more birds. And, is that a loaf of bread? To the untrained eye, it looks like the pharaohs were playing a very intense game of Pictionary. But for over 1,400 years, these weren't just mysterious carvings. They were a full-on linguistic black hole. No one knew what the hieroglyphs meant. They may as well have been emojis from another planet. Enter the Rosetta Stone. Not a language learning app, but a literal rock that became the linguistic cheat code of the ancient world. Discovered in 1799 by a soldier in Napoleon's army near the Egyptian town of Rosetta, modern-day Rashid. This black slab of granodiorite looked like nothing special until someone noticed it had the same message written 3 times, once in Greek, once in Demotic, the shorthand of ancient Egyptian scribes, and once in full-on hieroglyphic bling. Let that sink in. It was like stumbling on a time capsule labeled Ancient Egyptian for Dummies. To give a modern equivalent, imagine finding a scroll with the same recipe written in Latin, cursive English, and emoji. You don't speak Latin, but you can read English. From there, you start decoding the cursive, and slowly, the emoji. That's what the Rosetta Stone offered. It was a translation jackpot, hiding in plain sight for centuries, and it would take a team of very stubborn nerds to crack it. Now, before we get to our French hero, let's take a moment to understand why hieroglyphs were such a pain in the papyrus. Ancient Egyptian writing wasn't one tidy alphabet. No, it had logograms, symbols that represent entire words. For example, a picture of a duck, equal sign, duck. Phonograms, symbols that represent sounds, determinatives, symbols that help explain what kind of word it is, like a helpful but cryptic label. And to really keep you guessing, the writing could go left to right, right to left, or top to bottom, depending on the scribe's mood, the wind direction, or the spiritual alignment of row, probably. So who finally cracked the code? Cue dramatic lighting and a powdered wig. Jean-François Champollion, French linguist, polyglot prodigy, proud owner of the most stress-tested brain in 19th century Europe. By the time he was a teenager, Champollion was already fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, and Coptic. You know, just casual hobbies. He believed that Coptic, an Egyptian language still used in Christian liturgy, might be the key to unlocking hieroglyphs. Why? Because Coptic descended directly from ancient Egyptian, just with way fewer snakes and sun discs. Armed with this insight, the Rosetta Stone's Greek text, and what must have been an industrial-strength headache, Champollion began matching sounds, testing hypotheses, and poring over bird-filled inscriptions like a caffeinated crossword addict. Finally, in 1822, he had his aha moment. He realized hieroglyphs weren't purely symbolic, they were phonetic too. That loaf of bread, it wasn't just a snack, it made a sound, probably tea. Legend has it that when Champollion cracked the code, he burst into his brother's office shouting, "Je tiens l'affaire, I've got it," before immediately passing out from excitement, which is possibly the nerdiest mic drop in history. But this wasn't just an academic win. Deciphering hieroglyphs opened up 3,000 years of Egyptian history that had been locked behind incomprehensible squiggles. For the first time, we could actually read the temple inscriptions, tomb dedications, legal decrees, love poems, shopping lists, and oh yes, tax records. That's right. We finally unlocked the secrets of the pyramids and found out someone had been fined for not delivering enough grain. The Rosetta Stone became the MVP of Egyptology. It now sits in the British Museum, where it's been on display longer than most countries have existed. Egypt has politely, and not so politely, asked for it back several times, to which the British Museum has responded with a firm and historically consistent "No, but you may look at it behind glass." Today, the stone is more than a rock with 3 languages on it. It represents the persistence of curiosity, the power of language, and the idea that yes, you can learn a dead language using a rock, a French dictionary, and 900 tiny birds. So the next time you open Duolingo and feel proud for learning. Where is the bathroom? In Italian. Just remember, Napoleon unlocked an entire civilization with no lessons, no owl mascot, and a translation tool heavy enough to break your foot. The 19th century. A time of top hats, tea, and an insatiable obsession with dead pharaohs. If ancient Egypt was a brand, then the 1800s were its celebrity endorsement deal, with the entire Western world acting like they'd just discovered a new fandom. People weren't just intrigued by Egypt, they were unhinged for it. Cleopatra had gone viral. Let's rewind. After Napoleon's expedition brought home more than just heat stroke and sand in weird places, Europeans suddenly realized, wait a minute, these pyramids are kind of awesome. Egypt became the it girl of ancient civilizations. Everything Egyptian was exotic, mysterious, and just the right amount of spooky. This led to a phenomenon historians now lovingly call Egyptomania. And yes, it was as extra as it sounds. Step 1. Turn your house into a sarcophagus. Suddenly well-to-do Victorians wanted their homes to look like they'd been raided by Ramses II's interior decorator. Need a new chair? How about one shaped like a sphinx? Looking for a tasteful mirror? Let's slap a few obelisks on it and call it eternally chic. Furniture was now adorned with ankhs, papyrus columns, winged sun discs, and the ever-fashionable Eye of Horus. No surface was safe. You could walk into a London drawing room and see a fireplace designed like a temple entrance, complete with hieroglyphic stenciling, because nothing says cozy evening like curling up by the fire next to a decorative coffin motif. Step 2. Dress like a mummy. But make it fashion. Fashion followed furniture. Women wore dresses inspired by what people thought Egyptian royalty might have worn: flowing robes, gold detailing, snake bracelets, and enough eyeliner to survive a sandstorm. Men weren't immune either. Some strutted around in Egyptian-themed waistcoats, holding canes topped with scarabs or miniature obelisks. You know, in case you needed to summon Ray on your afternoon walk. Jewelry? All Egypt. All the time. Scarab amulets, pyramid-shaped lockets, and Isis pendants became the accessories of the century. If it looked like it came from a tomb, it probably ended up on someone's brooch. Step 3. Host a mummy party. No, seriously. Now here's where things get delightfully macabre. Victorians didn't just decorate with Egyptian flair, they brought it into their entertainment. Enter the mummy unwrapping party. Yes, this was an actual event where wealthy guests would gather in someone's home, drink tea, nibble cucumber sandwiches, and watch a real-life mummy get unwrapped on the parlor floor, like it was the world's worst birthday gift. These events were pitched as scientific demonstrations, but let's be honest, they were the ancient world equivalent of true crime dinner theatre. The host would hire a scholar or antiquities expert, often just someone with a mustache and an ego to narrate the process, while slowly peeling away linen strips from a 2000-year-old corpse, and people loved it. They gasped at the jewelry, oohed at the amulets, and occasionally took souvenirs. That's right, guests would sometimes leave with a small mummy finger or chunk of wrappings as a party favour. Imagine coming home from a soiree and saying, "I brought dessert, and also a cursed bone fragment." Step 4. Die in style. Egyptian-themed funerals. Because of course Egyptomania had to reach the grave. The 19th century was already obsessed with death. Hello, mourning jewelry and post-mortem photography. So ancient Egypt, where death was literally a full-time job, fit right in. Wealthy Victorians started requesting Egyptian-style tombs. Mausoleums were built to mimic pyramids or temples. Obelisks became popular gravestones, complete with inscriptions meant to look vaguely hieroglyphic, even if they said something like, "Beloved Mother of Three." Some even ordered coffins styled after sarcophagi, complete with their own golden death masks. No word on whether their pets were buried alongside them, a la pharaonic tradition. but let's not put it past them. Step 5. Build your own pyramid. Because why not? For the super committed, Egyptomania meant building actual pyramids. Europe and America both saw a boom in pyramid-shaped monuments, grave markers, and in rare cases, houses. Yes, a few brave souls thought, why live in a square when I could live in a triangle with mystic energy? One Scottish nobleman even had his estate's mausoleum shaped like a pyramid, and insisted he be buried upright, facing east, so he'd be ready for the afterlife commute. Why the obsession? Part of it was exoticism. Egypt was far enough removed to feel magical. Part of it was the sheer visual drama. Columns, gold, gods with animal heads. And part of it, frankly, was good old-fashioned imperialism. European powers had plundered so much of Egypt that it made sense they'd want to glamorize their loot. But even with all the mummy mania and obelisk fever, Egyptomania also sparked a genuine interest in archaeology, language and history. For every mummy finger pocketed at a party, there were scholars earnestly trying to piece together Egypt's real story. So yes, it was weird. Yes, it was tacky. And yes, it was wildly disrespectful at times. But it was also the start of something bigger. A modern fascination that would eventually give way to real preservation efforts. Museum studies and documentaries narrated by someone with a British accent. Tut became more famous dead than most people ever do alive. 1922. The year when archaeology turned from dusty digs to headline-grabbing blockbuster sensation. Enter Howard Carter, a man with a keen eye, a stubborn spirit, and apparently the patience of a saint, because what he uncovered would become the world's most famous archaeological treasure hunt and launch a media frenzy that made even Hollywood jealous. Carter's discovery, the tomb of Tutankhamun, better known as King Tut, the teenage pharaoh who ruled Egypt for less than a decade, and then promptly became the world's most famous corpse, the discovery that stopped the world before Tut's tomb was found. Most of Egypt's pharaohs were either long lost to history or known only to scholars. But Tut, nobody expected to find a near-intact tomb, especially one filled to the brim with more gold than you could shake a scepter at. Imagine the scene. Carter brushes away a bit of dirt, and suddenly, bam, he's staring into an underground palace, glittering with treasures. Chariots, thrones, jewelry, a solid gold coffin, so heavy, it probably needed its own moving company. It was like Indiana Jones meets Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, except instead of candy, it was priceless artifacts. The media goes wild. The Western press smelled a story that was part treasure hunt, part horror flick, and part royal soap opera. Newspapers worldwide splashed headlines about the Boy King's Golden Kingdom and secrets of the Pharaoh's curse. Because when you find a tomb sealed for over 3,000 years, the first thing you worry about isn't preserving history, it's curses. Curse of the mummy. Clickbait before clickbait. Here's the thing, the mummy's curse was mostly a journalist's wet dream. Yes, some people connected to the tomb's opening died under mysterious circumstances. Most notably Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's main funder, who passed away after a mosquito bite got infected. Cue the tabloids. Death stalks the pharaoh's tomb. Tutankhamun's revenge. Cursed mummy claims another victim. Was there really a curse? Probably not. But the myth was too good to pass up. Newspapers printed stories of unexplained illnesses, strange accidents, and spooky Egyptian ghosts lurking in London. The public ate it up, like it was the first ever true crime podcast. Tut's fame explodes. Tutankhamun's tiny statue, standing only about 4 feet 6 inches tall in life, and about 18 years old when he died, suddenly became a global celebrity. He went from obscurity to superstardom, his golden death mask plastered everywhere from museum walls to fashion runways. Tut's story had everything: youth, mystery, tragedy, and treasure. Plus, the added spice of curse drama made him a perfect tabloid darling. Hollywood even flirted with the idea of mummy movies, which would turn into a genre of their own, though none quite matched the real-life story's flair. What made Tut so interesting? Tut wasn't the most powerful pharaoh, far from it. He inherited the throne as a child, ruled for about 10 years, and died under mysterious circumstances, around age 18 or 19. Modern science suggests he may have suffered from genetic disorders, or even a nasty chariot accident. But his tomb's discovery gave us a glimpse of Egypt's wealth, art and funerary customs that was unparalleled. Most tombs had been looted over centuries, so Carter's find was like uncovering a time capsule. For the first time in millennia, historians could study the artifacts exactly as they were placed by the ancient Egyptians, from golden sandals to intricately painted coffins. Every item told a story. The man behind the discovery, Howard Carter, was no typical adventurer. He was meticulous, almost obsessive about documenting every detail. While others hacked away recklessly, looking at you, Belzoni, Carter treated the tomb like a sacred library. His famous line when he first peered inside the tomb, "Yes, wonderful things." That understated British charm hides the explosion of excitement that must have been going on inside his head. Imagine discovering something so monumental that it would make history books, museum exhibits, and even your mum's fridge magnet. Tut's curse versus science. The curse idea stuck around so much that it overshadowed the real scientific reasons behind the illnesses and deaths. Many scholars now say that poor ventilation inside the tomb exposed explorers to ancient fungi and bacteria, causing respiratory infections. So no, Tut wasn't sending ghostly assassins. It was more like mummy mold, which is less Indiana Jones, and more don't forget your allergy meds. The legacy of the discovery King Tut's tomb changed the way the world looked at ancient Egypt. It wasn't just dusty ruins or mysterious pyramids anymore. It was a story full of drama, youth, and tragedy that everyone could relate to. Museums scrambled to display Tut's treasures, exhibitions traveled the globe, attracting millions, and the public's fascination with Egypt exploded, sparking new archaeological digs, books, films, and endless academic debates. Tut might have been king for a hot minute, but he's had a longer posthumous career than most Hollywood celebrities. He's the OG influencer, just with more gold, fewer tweets, and the occasional spooky headline about curses. So next time you see his golden mask, remember, Tut became more famous dead than most people ever do alive. And that, my friend, is the ultimate plot twist in history. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'd think exploring the pyramids would have become a bit easier. After all, we've got smartphones, satellites, and robots that can vacuum your floors without a complaint. But nope, when it comes to the pyramids, modern technology hasn't just made things easier, it's turned pyramid exploration into a full-on science fiction adventure with a generous splash of comedy. First off, picture this. Scientists have actually sent tiny robots into the tight, dusty crawl spaces inside the Great Pyramid. These robots are equipped with cameras, lasers, and all sorts of sensors designed to scan walls, detect hidden chambers, and maybe, just maybe, find lost treasure or a secret passage that's been hiding for thousands of years. What did the robots find? Well, after maneuvering through narrow shafts that would give claustrophobics nightmares, one of them discovered a slightly smaller room. Yes, groundbreaking stuff. It's basically the archaeological equivalent of opening your fridge and finding a leftover sandwich. Exciting at first, but you hoped for pizza. But these robotic explorations aren't just about, is there a secret chamber behind this wall? They're part of a much bigger scientific push. Satellite imaging and remote sensing technologies now allow researchers to scan the entire pyramid complex from space. Using radar and infrared, scientists can detect differences in stone density, revealing voids or structures that might be invisible to the naked eye. Imagine playing the world's slowest, most expensive game of Where's Waldo, except Waldo is a 4500-year-old secret room. Even laser scanning, also known as LiDAR, has become a go-to technique. It's so precise that it can create a detailed 3D model of the pyramid's surface down to millimeters. So if a tiny crack appears on the pyramid's outer casing stones, Egyptologists will know before it turns into a major disaster. Think of it as the pyramid's very own health monitoring system, which hopefully alerts them before the sandstorm strikes. Still, despite all this tech wizardry, the pyramids manage to keep their secrets better than your most mysterious friend who never answers texts. There are still questions no gadget can fully solve. How did the ancient Egyptians manage to cut and move those massive limestone blocks so precisely? Why did they decide on such a precise alignment with the cardinal points, north, south, east, and west, as if they had an ancient GPS system? And what about the so-called air shafts inside the Great Pyramid? Are they ventilation ducts, symbolic pathways for the pharaoh's soul, or just architectural quirks? Modern science hasn't quite nailed these mysteries yet, Then there's the incredible design and mathematical precision of the pyramids. The Great Pyramid's dimensions are so precise that some researchers swear it encodes advanced knowledge of geometry, astronomy, even the value of pi, thousands of years before it was officially discovered. If that's not a sign that the ancient Egyptians were the original nerds flexing on us all, what is? They were basically building 3D puzzles on a colossal scale, while we're still trying to put together IKEA furniture without losing a screw. The cutting-edge tools of today have made it easier to explore without causing damage. After centuries of explorers and treasure hunters hacking and digging, it's nice to see science taking the look but don't touch approach. Plus, with drone technology, archaeologists can now hover above the pyramid complexes to capture stunning aerial views and monitor changes over time. Though let's be honest, the drones probably spend more time avoiding confused tourists waving selfie sticks than actually scanning for secrets. On the lighter side, modern Egyptology isn't without its own share of shenanigans. Scientists and tech teams have had to adapt to desert heat, sandstorms, and curious camels who seem determined to photobomb every scan. And while robots can crawl through tight spaces, they can't exactly bring back a cold drink or a snack for the team. So, the mix of ancient mystery and modern tech sometimes feels like a high-budget reality TV show. Survivor Pyramid Edition. Even with all our tools, the pyramids continue to inspire more questions than answers. Perhaps that's part of their eternal appeal. These massive stone monuments are less about what we know and more about what we wonder. Each new discovery, whether it's a minor crack or an entirely new chamber, sends ripples through the archaeological community and sparks wild theories, some more plausible than others. One thing is clear: despite thousands of years, centuries of study, and all the futuristic gadgets, the pyramids remain smarter than we thought possible. They're not just relics of an ancient world, but puzzles that challenge our understanding of history, engineering, and human ambition. So next time you think about the pyramids, remember, we've put robots inside them, scanned them from space and mapped every stone. But these giant triangles still keep their best secrets close to their chest. Maybe they're just enjoying the show. The pyramids and ancient Egyptian civilization have been a goldmine for historians, archaeologists, and curious wanderers for centuries. Thanks to tireless work, both ancient and modern, we now know more about the Egyptians' daily lives, their beliefs, their engineering wizardry, and even what they had for breakfast. Spoiler alert, it probably wasn't avocado toast. These discoveries have transformed how we view human history, proving that the ancient world was far from primitive. It was brilliant, complex, and often surprisingly relatable. We've uncovered elaborate tomb paintings that tell stories, intricate jewelry that rivals modern bling, and papyrus scrolls that reveal administrative genius. This isn't just about dusty old stones. It's about a civilization that laid the groundwork for writing systems, religious ideas, and even medicine. For example, Egyptian doctors performed surgeries, set broken bones, and developed remedies using herbs and honey. Basically the original Dr. Google, but with a lot more bandages and less online trolling. But while the good is undeniably impressive, the bad tends to get glossed over in tourist brochures and documentary voiceovers, because the story of Egyptology isn't just about awe and admiration. It's also a tale of looting, colonialism, and cultural insensitivity that's made a mess of priceless heritage. Take, for instance, the many artifacts that have found their way from Egyptian sands into the halls of Western museums. Those glittering statues, golden masks, and sarcophagi that wow crowds. Many didn't get there by gift or fair trade. They were acquired during an era when explorers and imperial powers thought, if we see it, we own it. Cue the classic phrase that's become an ironic catchphrase. We came, we saw, we labelled it British property. The British Museum, the Louvre, and many other institutions boast staggering collections. But the stories behind how they got there often involve force, deceit, or good old-fashioned, whoops, I meant to take this. This artifact plundering didn't just rob Egypt of physical treasures, it stripped away pieces of its cultural identity. Imagine walking into your home and finding half your family photos missing, then having to go to someone else's house to see them. That's roughly what happened, and it's why debates over repatriation, the return of artifacts to their countries of origin, are still hot-button issues today. Museums argue they're preserving history, but many Egyptians feel like their heritage is being displayed behind glass cases in a foreign land, out of reach and out of context. On top of the theft problem, there's the issue of cultural disrespect. Early explorers and treasure hunters didn't exactly treat these sites like sacred spaces. They were more like overzealous tourists on a demolition spree. Tombs were smashed open, priceless frescoes were chipped away, and fragile artifacts were carted off without proper documentation. Sometimes, these archaeologists were basically glorified treasure hunters with a flair for destruction. This recklessness has made some ancient sites more fragile today than when the pharaohs themselves ruled. Modern tourism hasn't helped either. Millions of visitors trek through these historic sites every year, creating wear and tear that centuries of desert winds couldn't achieve alone. Imagine thousands of tourists squeezing through narrow corridors, snapping photos with flash, and occasionally knocking over a priceless statue. Despite preservation efforts, the balance between letting people experience history and protecting it remains a tricky dance. It's kind of like letting your hyperactive cousin loose in a priceless antique store. Fun to watch, but nerve-wracking. Then there's the tangled web of museum politics. Who owns history? Who decides what gets displayed, restored, or studied? These questions can turn passionate debates into bureaucratic nightmares. Countries like Egypt want their treasures back, but Western institutions often resist, citing preservation, accessibility, and legal ownership. It's a diplomatic tug-of-war, with cultural pride and historical justice hanging in the balance. Sometimes it feels less like a serious conversation and more like a family feud over who gets to keep grandma's antique vase. However, despite all this mess, there's a silver lining. Awareness of cultural heritage preservation has grown enormously in recent decades. Egypt itself has become more active in protecting its monuments and artifacts, creating museums like the Grand Egyptian Museum near the pyramids, designed to showcase treasures with respect and care. International cooperation has increased, with stricter laws against looting and new technologies helping monitor and protect archaeological sites. It's a slow process, but the message is clear. History belongs to everyone, but it deserves respect and careful stewardship. So what have we learned? We've learned that the pyramids and their treasures are more than just Instagram backdrops or shiny relics. They are powerful symbols of human achievement and cultural identity that survived millennia. But we've also learned that how we treat the past reflects who we are in the present. The mistakes of looting, disrespect, and cultural insensitivity are warnings, reminding us to approach history with humility, care, and a sense of shared responsibility. In the end, the story of what we've learned and what we've ruined is as layered and complex as the pyramids themselves. And maybe, just maybe, the best way forward is to listen more, take fewer souvenirs, and appreciate that some treasures are priceless because they belong to the whole world, not just a few shelves in a museum. Alright, so you've learned about the grandeur, the mysteries, the curses, and the accidental wrecking balls that have shaped the story of the pyramids. Now you're probably wondering, should I go explore one myself? Maybe crawl through those narrow corridors, find secret chambers, and live out my Indiana Jones fantasy? Well, let's just say, before you pack your bags and start practicing your heroic whip cracks, here's a quick reality check disguised as a how-to guide for modern pyramid exploration. Step 1. Get ready to be ridiculously hot. We're talking desert heat that will melt the soles of your shoes and turn your sunscreen into a sticky second skin. The pyramids sit smack in the middle of the Sahara's enthusiasm for roasting anything that moves. So unless you're part camel, bring water, and lots of it. Step 2. Prepare for sand. Not just a little bit of sand, but sand in places you didn't even know could hold sand. Sand in your shoes, your socks, your ears, and yes, even in your nose. It's like the pyramids come with a free exfoliation package, and no amount of brushing will get rid of it all. You'll be sandy until at least your next shower, or the one after that. Step 3. Don't forget the angry archaeologists. These folks are the real guardians of the pyramids, minus the snakes and ancient curses, but with a serious eye for trespassers. They have spent years protecting these sites from being turned into giant playgrounds. So if you're thinking about squeezing through off-limits tunnels or finding a shortcut, think again. You'll probably get a very stern talking to or be politely escorted off-site, which is much less cinematic but significantly safer. Step 4. Embrace confusion. The inside of a pyramid isn't some neatly mapped out museum exhibit. It's a labyrinth of cramped crawl spaces, sudden drops, and rooms that make you question your sense of direction and your life choices. You might spend more time bumping into walls or accidentally triggering security traps, than actually finding any hidden treasure. Spoiler: the treasure is usually just dust and spiderwebs. And finally, the best piece of advice for would-be pyramid explorers: if you want to get cursed and confused while crawling through a dusty maze, just visit IKEA. It's cheaper, there's no risk of ancient death traps, and the only thing you'll need to fear is assembling your furniture without losing your mind. Plus, the only curse you'll get is when you step on a stray Allen wrench in the dark. So yeah, as romantic as it sounds to explore the pyramids in person, your best bet is to admire them from a respectful distance, read up on their fascinating history, and maybe binge watch a few documentaries or adventure movies instead. The pyramids will still be there tomorrow, and you'll still have all your toes intact. The most ridiculous inventions that somehow changed the world. Chapter 1. Flammable pajamas and other sleepwear nightmares. Let's start this wild ride with something you probably never thought twice about: your pajamas. You know, those cozy, soft outfits that promise a peaceful night's sleep? Well, believe it or not, there was a time when pajamas were basically a fire hazard waiting to happen. Yeah, sleepwear was more like spontaneous combustion wear, and not in a fun superhero origin story way. Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pajamas became popular in Western countries as a more comfortable alternative to nightshirts. Sounds innocent enough, right? Wrong. The fabrics used back then, mostly lightweight cotton and rayon, were incredibly flammable. Imagine slipping into your comfy pajamas, only for them to catch fire instantly if you got too close to a candle, stove, or, heaven forbid, a smoking pipe. People often joked that bedtime could double as a fire drill. So how did this pyrotechnic problem come about? Well, early industrial fabric production focused on making cloth soft and affordable, but flame resistance wasn't exactly on the priority list. Cotton and rayon, while cozy, had a nasty habit of igniting quickly and burning fiercely. The hazard was real. There were documented cases of children and adults suffering severe burns simply because their pajamas touched an open flame or spark. The situation got so out of hand that in the 1930s, the United States stepped in with one of its first fire safety regulations focused on sleepwear. The Flammable Fabrics Act of 1953 eventually made it mandatory for pajamas to be made of flame-resistant materials or treated with chemicals that would slow down burning. These rules basically turned pajamas from fire traps into something you could safely lounge in without worrying about turning into a human torch. You can only imagine the kinds of warning labels and safety campaigns that came with this. Keep away from open flames. Do not use near candles. Not recommended for use during impromptu campfires in your living room. The early ads probably looked like they were for fire extinguishers, rather than bedtime clothes. And here's the kicker. These flame-resistant treatments weren't perfect either. Some early chemicals were a bit toxic, which means in the pursuit of not burning up, you might have been inhaling suspicious chemicals all night. Talk about trading one nightmare for another. Nowadays, thanks to better fabric technology and stricter safety standards, pajamas are mostly safe. But this little historical quirk is a great reminder that progress sometimes comes with a lot of accidental fires. So next time you tuck in for the night, give a little thanks that your PJs won't double as a matchstick, because nothing says bedtime like spontaneous combustion. Yeah, let's leave that trend in the past. Imagine being trapped inside a giant metal coffin that breathes for you. Sounds like the setup for a sci-fi horror movie, right? But no, this was reality for thousands of people during the mid-20th century thanks to the iron lung, one of history's most bizarre yet life-saving inventions. The iron lung came about during one of humanity's most terrifying health crises, the polio epidemics. Polio, a viral disease, had a nasty habit of attacking the nerves that control muscles, especially the ones responsible for breathing. When those muscles stopped working, victims simply couldn't breathe on their own. The result? They needed a mechanical way to keep air flowing into their lungs. Enter the iron lung, officially known as a negative pressure ventilator. Don't worry, that's just a fancy term for a big metal cylinder that your whole body, except your head, fits into. The machine worked by creating a vacuum around the patient's torso, causing the chest to expand and air to flow into the lungs, then releasing the vacuum, allowing the chest to contract and push the air out. In other words, the iron lung basically mimicked the natural process of breathing by forcing your body to inflate and deflate like a strange, noisy accordion. It was terrifying to watch, and even more terrifying to experience. Imagine lying motionless inside a tight metal tube, your head poking out like a periscope, with rhythmic whooshing sounds as the machine sucked air in and blew it out. You couldn't move much, couldn't sit up, and had to rely entirely on this clunky, noisy device just to survive. Despite its intimidating appearance, the iron lung was a lifesaver. It gave patients with paralyzed breathing muscles a fighting chance, sometimes for weeks, months, or even years. Some people lived inside these machines for so long that the iron lung became their new reality. Hospitals became dotted with these mechanical sleeping pods, and families had to adjust to the eerie sight of loved ones encased in steel. But the iron lung had its quirks and challenges. It was huge, heavy, and not exactly portable. If the power failed, patients faced a dire emergency, and caregivers had to hand pump air into the machine until electricity was restored. The size of the device also meant that patients were pretty much trapped. No bathroom breaks without help. No spontaneous dance parties inside these metal tombs. From a modern perspective, it seems almost cruel, but the iron lung was a remarkable feat of engineering for its time. It was a bridge between helplessness and hope, a mechanical breath of life when nature had cruelly snatched it away. By the 1950s and 60s, the invention of the polio vaccine drastically reduced the need for iron lungs. Suddenly, this massive, terrifying machine became a relic, but its impact remains without it. Many who contracted severe polio wouldn't have survived. It stands as a testament to human ingenuity when faced with impossible odds. So next time you complain about your noisy air conditioner or bulky winter coat, remember those who relied on a giant metal barrel just to breathe. The iron lung wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't fun, but it saved lives. Who knew being trapped in a giant metal coffin could be life-saving? Not exactly a spa day, but hey, breathing is pretty important. Chapter 3. Radium toothpaste and the glow-in-the-dark health craze. Step aside, fluoride. There was a time when the early 20th century was positively glowing with excitement over something far more radioactive. Yes, radium toothpaste. You heard that right. Long before scientists fully understood the dangers of radiation, radium was hailed as the magic ingredient for everything from glowing health to eternal youth. The era was so obsessed with radioactive miracle products that even toothpaste got a radioactive makeover. Back in the early 1900s, Radium was discovered to be this mysterious, glowing element with seemingly magical properties. It was like the world had found a real-life superhero mineral. Radium sparkled, it shimmered, and it gave off an eerie glow that fascinated everyone, from scientists to beauty gurus to the average Joe. And naturally, marketers jumped on the bandwagon faster than you can say, radioactive decay. Why just clean your teeth when you could also bathe them in the glow of atomic energy? Radium toothpaste was pitched as the ultimate dental care product. The ads promised stronger teeth, healthier gums, and an otherworldly sparkle that would light up any room. Literally, some bottles even boasted that their product could revitalize your smile with the power of science. If that sounds like a marketing pitch from a sci-fi B-movie, well, that's because it basically was. People enthusiastically slathered the glowing goop onto their teeth every morning, brushing away plaque, and, unknowingly, inviting radioactive particles into their mouths. For a while, no one questioned it. After all, how dangerous could a little glowing powder be? It was the future, baby. But of course, the glow-in-the-dark health craze had a dark side, quite literally. As more and more people used these products, the harmful effects of radium exposure began to surface. Scientists and doctors started to notice that constant contact with radium was causing serious health problems: jawbone deterioration, anemia, and even radiation poisoning. The glowing smiles were masking something far more sinister. One of the most tragic and bizarre chapters of this radioactive obsession involves the Radium Girls. These were factory workers, mostly young women, who painted watch dials with radium-based luminous paint. To get a precise tip for painting, they would lick their brushes, unknowingly ingesting dangerous amounts of radium. The results were horrific: severe radiation poisoning, disfigured jaws, a condition gruesomely nicknamed radium jaw, and early deaths. Their suffering eventually led to important labor reforms and stricter regulations on radioactive materials, but the damage was done. Back to the toothpaste. Once the health risks became clear, radium toothpaste quickly went from miracle cure to health hazard. But the public wasn't ready to completely give up on their glowing teeth. Some folks clung to the idea that a little radiation never hurt anyone, probably because admitting the truth was less comforting than the idea of a radiant, glowing smile. This chapter in history is a hilarious and horrifying reminder of how people can fall for science when it sounds flashy enough. The idea that a radioactive element, one that could literally kill you, was marketed as a dental health aid is the kind of absurdity that makes you laugh and cringe at the same time. So, next time you're brushing your teeth with safe, boring fluoride toothpaste, spare a thought for those early 20th century folks who thought, why just have a clean smile when you can have a glowing smile powered by radiation? Because nothing says healthy smile like a dose of radiation, until it isn't. In the end, radium toothpaste didn't just clean teeth. It sparked an important lesson about the dangers of blind faith in new miracle products. It's a glowing cautionary tale wrapped in nostalgia and just a little bit of madness. Chapter 4. Lawn Darts and the Deadly Backyard Game. Imagine a sunny afternoon in suburbia. Kids running around, parents lounging with lemonade, and in the middle of the lawn, a game that looks innocent enough. Colourful darts flying through the air, aiming for a metal target stuck in the grass. Sounds like harmless backyard fun, right? Well, not exactly. Welcome to the world of lawn darts, the game that combined leisure and lethality in one flying, spear-like package. Lawn darts, also known as jarts. Yes, that's their official name. And it sounds just as dangerous as it is. Were invented in the mid-20th century and quickly became a staple of outdoor recreation. The game's premise was simple. Throw these hefty pointed darts underhand toward a circular target on the ground, scoring points based on accuracy. Easy enough, except here's the catch. These darts weren't your typical plastic safe-for-kids party favors. They were essentially mini javelins with metal tips designed to stick firmly into the lawn. It's like someone said, how can we make darts more thrilling? Oh, I know. Let's add some serious stabbing power. During their heyday in the 1960s and 70s, lawn darts were wildly popular with families looking for a little outdoor competition. But as the name jarts subtly hints, the game was less about light-hearted fun and more about testing your ability not to impale yourself or your neighbors. Despite warnings and instructions plastered on the boxes about safety, accidents began to pile up. Kids, adults, and even pets sometimes became unintentional targets of these flying missiles. Backyard barbecues quickly turned into emergency room visits. The injury reports were no joke. Lawn darts caused lacerations, bruises, and in some tragic cases, severe eye injuries and even fatalities. Because, yes, aiming a spear-like object at the ground requires quite a bit of accuracy, but a miss can be catastrophic. The most heartbreaking incidents involved children accidentally getting hit, which spurred increasing alarm from parents, medical professionals, and safety advocates. It turns out that a backyard game where the goal is not to become a human dartboard isn't exactly the best recipe for family fun. In the early 1980s, the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission stepped in after dozens of serious injuries, and at least 3 deaths were directly linked to lawn darts. By 1988, the sale and manufacture of lawn darts with metal tips were banned in the US. It was a hard but necessary lesson in how to balance fun with common sense. For those who still longed for the nostalgia of lawn darts without risking bodily harm, plastic-tipped safety darts were introduced. But let's be honest, they never quite captured the thrill of the original. Interestingly, lawn darts aren't just an American story. Similar bans and regulations cropped up worldwide, especially as awareness grew about the danger these flying weapons posed. What started as an innocent pastime became a cautionary tale about how sometimes inventions can be fun and deadly in the same breath. So what can we learn from the saga of lawn darts? Maybe that sometimes backyard games need a little less spear your neighbor and a little more pass the chips, or that inventors should maybe think twice before combining metal spikes and enthusiastic amateurs. If you're picturing a group of parents nervously eyeing a kid about to throw a rocket-sharp dart, you're not alone. The game's darkly funny legacy is that it offered a clear rule. It's only fun if nobody ends up in the ER, which, as it turns out, is a pretty solid rule for most things. The ban on lawn darts didn't kill the spirit of outdoor play, of course, but it did send a message loud and clear. Sometimes the line between fun and fatal is just a few inches and a sharp metal point away. And so, if you ever stumble upon a set of lawn darts, maybe admire them as a relic of a more reckless time, then stick to safer games like cornhole, or, better yet, just watching other people risk it all, because nothing says backyard champion quite like managing to keep all your limbs intact. Chapter 5. Asbestos, everything. The fireproof miracle that didn't... Asbestos, the miracle material that could do everything except not kill you. Once hailed as the answer to fire safety, industrial strength, and home insulation, asbestos was so widely adored it ended up in houses, toasters, fake snow, ironing boards, and even the inside of your popcorn bag. Because of course, nothing makes a movie night pop like a sprinkle of microscopic death dust. Let's rewind to the early 20th century, when asbestos was the Beyoncé of building materials. It was cheap, durable, and most impressively, nearly impossible to set on fire. You could practically bathe it in lava, and it would come out looking smug and untouched. That kind of fireproof magic meant it found its way into nearly every corner of modern life. Ceiling tiles, asbestos, brake pads, asbestos, children's Halloween costumes, you guessed it. Asbestos, for the tiny ghost who wants to be extra fire-safe while trick-or-treating. The name asbestos comes from the Greek word for inextinguishable, which is fitting because the real problem turned out to be that its health effects were also inextinguishable. See, asbestos is made up of long, thin, fibrous crystals that, when disturbed, break down into microscopic shards. These little particles float invisibly in the air, hang around for hours, and once inhaled, lodge themselves deep into your lungs, like uninvited guests that never leave. Over time, they cause all sorts of party-ending illnesses like asbestosis, mesothelioma, and lung cancer. So while your house might be fireproof, your lungs were quietly turning into a ticking time bomb. Here's the kicker. Scientists had suspicions about asbestos dangers as early as the 1920s, but the real horror movie didn't get rolling until decades later, when those early construction workers and factory employees started mysteriously getting sick en masse. Turns out, breathing in a bunch of needle-like death fibers for 30 years isn't exactly the recipe for a long, happy retirement. But before the world wised up, we really went all in. Schools were built with asbestos, hospitals, cruise ships, entire apartment buildings. In one infamous example, asbestos was used to insulate theatres so thoroughly that a fire on stage could be smothered in seconds. The irony, of course, is that anyone who survived the fire might later die from watching too many shows surrounded by air flavored with carcinogenic confetti. Perhaps the most surreal chapter in asbestos history is its cameo in household goods. In the mid-1900s, you could find it in baby powder, oven mitts, Christmas tree flocking, and even fashion. Yes, asbestos evening gowns were a real thing, because when you want to feel truly glamorous, nothing says elegance like a dress that won't ignite, but might slowly turn you into a ghost. Even cigarette filters had asbestos in them for a time. That's right. You were puffing on tobacco wrapped in toxic insulation. It's almost poetic. Smoke for the lungs, and asbestos for dessert. The true wake-up call didn't come until the 1970s and 80s, when lawsuits, documentaries, and horror stories started stacking up. Countries finally began banning or tightly regulating asbestos use, though to this day, some still allow it in small amounts, as if just a little poison is somehow okay. In the US, it's not fully banned, and certain industries still use safe forms of it, which is a bit like saying, don't worry, it's just the friendly kind of landmine. The legacy of asbestos is a strange one, a case study in how something hailed as humanity's savior can, over time, reveal itself as the ultimate backstabber. It's also a reminder that too good to be true often is, especially when the good part involves coating your home in a material that doubles as microscopic shrapnel. So the next time you walk into a vintage building and marvel at its quaint design, maybe also marvel at the fact that you're not coughing up tiny mineral needles. Modern construction may have its flaws. Looking at you, drywall that shatters when you glance at it too hard. But at least it doesn't kill you softly over 30 years. Asbestos gave us one great gift, the ultimate punchline to hubris. Fireproof? Yes. Life-proof? Not so much. Chapter 6. The Segway. The transportation revolution that wasn't. The Segway. A device so boldly futuristic, it was unveiled under a code name, promised to change the way cities are built, and ended up mostly changing the way tourists look when they're trying not to fall over in front of a fountain. Let's rewind to 2001, a time of chunky flip phones, low-rise jeans, and unlimited optimism about the future of tech. Enter Dean Kamen, an inventor who gave the world the insulin pump, and then decided his next great gift to humanity would be a self-balancing, two-wheeled scooter. It was called Project Ginger in its early days, which already sounds like a failed energy drink. When the product was finally unveiled, it got a name almost as confusing as its purpose. The Segway Human Transporter. Not exactly sleek branding. It's like calling a car the four-wheeled Velocity Box. But that didn't stop the hype machine. Jeff Bezos said it would be bigger than the internet. Steve Jobs reportedly predicted it would be as revolutionary as the personal computer. There were whispers it might replace cars entirely. City planners would rethink infrastructure. Sidewalks would be redesigned. Humans would glide into the future upright, helmeted, and no longer constrained by the tyranny of walking. Then the Segway actually launched. And, well, it turns out there's a fine line between world-changing and weird-looking. First off, it cost $5,000. That's a lot of money to pay for something that basically looked like a blender on wheels. And while it was marketed as a personal vehicle, no one was entirely sure where you were supposed to ride it. Too fast for sidewalks, too slow for roads, too wide for tight indoor spaces, too fragile for cobblestone, too awkward for dignity. In short, it was the ideal solution for a transportation problem that didn't really exist. Let's not forget the user interface, your entire body. The Segway used gyroscopic sensors to balance itself and move based on how you leaned. Slightly forward, you inch ahead. Tilt backward, you stop. Have one moment of hesitation while trying to impress your date by gliding over to dinner. You may very well kiss the pavement. It looked easy on the commercials. In real life, it was like trying to drive a unicycle using only your hopes and dreams. And then came the public. Oh, the public. If there's one thing people love more than innovation, it's laughing at innovation that looks like a robot trying to ice skate. Mall cops adopted Segways and became punchlines. Tourists started renting them in groups, creating scooter convoys of accidental chaos. Even celebrities tried to hop aboard, and many of them promptly hopped off, violently. In one of the more poetic moments in ironic invention history, the British businessman who bought the Segway company in 2009 tragically died by accidentally driving his Segway off a cliff. If that's not a Shakespearean plot twist, what is? Despite all the stumbles, literal and financial, the Segway did manage to carve out a few niches. Police departments used them in airports and stadiums. Security guards embraced them to cover more ground without sacrificing snack time. And of course, Segway tours became a rite of passage in any city where you could also buy an I Heart City name, shot glass. But even as it found uses, the dream of Segway World, with thousands of us gliding to work in synchronized silence, died a slow, two-wheeled death. By 2020, Segway officially stopped production of its iconic PT, personal transporter, closing the book on a machine that promised the moon and delivered, maybe a lazy crescent. The future, it turned out, preferred bicycles, scooters, and electric skateboards, things that either had heritage or actual cool factor. Yet, in its own bizarre way, the Segway did influence the world. It paved the path, sometimes literally, for micromobility. It got people thinking about green transport, energy efficiency, and alternative commuting. It inspired the development of hoverboards, those glorified ankle traps, e-scooters, and eventually autonomous delivery bots. It also, arguably, pioneered the art of tech hype, gone hilariously sideways. So maybe the Segway didn't change urban planning forever, but it changed something arguably more important: our ability to laugh, to meme, and to point at a machine and say, "That's the future," if the future forgot how to be cool. The Segway taught us that not every revolution comes on two wheels. Sometimes it comes with a crash helmet, a steep learning curve, and the understanding that just because something balances itself doesn't mean it'll stay upright in history. Chapter 7. The Phrenology Helmet. Reading your mind, one bump at a time. Let's set the scene. It's the 19th century. Science is booming, beards are big, and doctors are still cheerfully sawing off limbs without anesthesia. Into this era of curiosity and questionable hygiene marches a new science that promises to unlock the secrets of your personality, intelligence, morality, and all by rubbing your head like a magic 8-ball. Welcome to Phrenology, the study of skull bumps as a roadmap to the human soul. It sounds absurd now, and to be fair, it was absurd then too. But for a while, Phrenology was taken very seriously. Its founder, Franz Joseph Gall, was an Austrian physician who believed that the brain was the organ of the mind, which is true. Unfortunately, he then jumped the rails and decided that different parts of the brain controlled different traits, and that the size of those parts could be physically measured by feeling the contours of someone's skull. If you had a prominent bump above your ear, congratulations, you had a highly developed destructiveness organ. A dent near the back, sorry, your conjugal love zone was tragically underdeveloped. Better luck next marriage. Practitioners would wear what looked like a cross between a colander and a Victorian torture device. The Phrenology helmet. This contraption supposedly helped them chart the rises and dips of your head with scientific precision, though it mostly made you look like an extra from a steampunk version of The Matrix. People sat for these exams as if getting their skulls mapped was as routine as having their portrait painted or getting measured for a new corset. You'd walk in thinking you were just shy, and walk out with a chart that told you your cautiousness node was off the charts, and that you'd probably never achieve greatness unless someone massaged your firmness lump daily. Now it's tempting to laugh, and you should, but keep in mind that this pseudoscience wasn't just a quirky parlor game. It got serious. Phrenology was used to justify everything from hiring decisions to prison sentences. Employers used it to screen candidates, because who wouldn't want to hire someone with a beautifully bulging perseverance area? Some schools used it to guide student development, and in darker corners it was weaponized to promote racist and classist ideologies, with claims that certain groups had inferior skull shapes. It's the unholy grandparent of scientific racism, and a cautionary tale in how objective measurements can go horribly subjective, especially when powered by ego, bias, and a measuring spoon. Despite its misuse, phrenology stuck around for decades. Why? Because it gave people something science rarely delivers. A shortcut. Why spend years getting to know someone when you could just poke their forehead and declare, "Ah yes, highly developed mirthfulness"? It was like astrology for the skull, and like all good pseudosciences, it had just enough real science flavor to seem plausible. It talked about the brain, it used words like cerebral faculties, and most importantly, it had charts. Never underestimate the persuasive power of a chart. By the early 20th century, Phrenology began its slow, bumpy decline. Real neuroscience was gaining traction, and people were starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, the complexities of human personality couldn't be explained by a dent behind your left ear. The helmet was finally shelved, the bump maps were rolled up, and phrenology took its place in the museum of dubious ideas, next to bloodletting, alchemy, and diet cigarettes. But let's give phrenology its due. It tried. In a world that barely understood germs, it was an earnest, if hilariously misguided, attempt to explore how the brain worked. It helped spark early conversations about brain localization, which later scientists would confirm through far more accurate and less forehead-pokey methods. And perhaps more importantly, it taught us a vital lesson: just because something wears the mask of science doesn't mean it deserves your head. Today, phrenology lives on mostly in novelty items and history books. You've probably seen the classic porcelain head with the labeled brain sections in some hipster cafe, or on the desk of a movie villain who collects antique medical gear. It's equal parts spooky and hilarious. A relic of a time when people thought personality came pre-installed, like Microsoft Office, in your skull. So next time you're feeling moody or indecisive, resist the urge to palpate your cranium. Just accept that your brain, in all its glorious mystery, refuses to be reduced to a lumpy topographic map. And if anyone offers to read your bumps, run, preferably with your fully intact self-preservation bump leading the way. Chapter 8. Early X-rays and the radiologist's accidental self-experimentation. Let's rewind to the 1890s, a time when electricity was still a magical force, beards were luxurious and respected, and medical innovation often looked a lot like a mad science fair project with a tragic ending. Enter Wilhelm Conrad Roentgen, a German physicist who accidentally discovered one of the most important medical breakthroughs in history, the X-ray. And because this was the 19th century, he did it the way many great scientific minds of the era did, by messing around in a dark lab and zapping things until something glowed. Roentgen had been experimenting with cathode rays and vacuum tubes when he noticed something peculiar. A nearby screen coated with a fluorescent substance started to light up, even though it wasn't anywhere near the beam. Stranger still, when he put his hand between the tube and the screen, he could see the outline of his bones. Naturally, he did what any self-respecting scientist would do. He cranked up the current and started sticking more things into the mystery beam. Eventually, he took what's widely considered the first X-ray photo of his wife's hand. Her reaction, reportedly, was not one of wonder, but of existential horror. Seeing your own skeleton in 1895 was basically the Victorian equivalent of seeing a ghost, except the ghost was you. Soon the scientific world was buzzing with excitement. X-rays could see inside the body, no more guessing what that lump was, or cracking someone open just to investigate. But with all this wonder came one small problem. No one had any idea what they were actually messing with. X-rays were invisible, silent, and seemed to pass through flesh like a ghost through walls. People thought they were harmless, like light, but spooky. And so, without gloves, goggles, or a shred of safety training, early researchers dove in head first. Some of the earliest radiologists became unintentional pioneers in accidental self-experimentation, which is a polite way of saying they slowly zapped themselves into health crises. A man named Clarence Daly, an assistant to Thomas Edison, became one of the first tragic examples. Daly subjected his own hands to hours of radiation exposure while helping Edison develop an X-ray device. He eventually developed severe radiation burns, lost fingers, then arms, and ultimately died from radiation-induced cancer. His death was a sobering moment, though not sobering enough to stop others from doing basically the same thing for another few decades. It wasn't just medical researchers who jumped onto the X-ray bandwagon. In the early 20th century, X-ray machines became the iPhones of their day. Everyone wanted one, and nobody quite understood how dangerous they were. Shoe stores installed X-ray viewers to let customers see the bones in their feet while trying on new footwear. Yes, you could get a new pair of Oxfords and a fresh dose of radiation, all before lunch. Street fairs featured X-ray booths, where you could get a fun little picture of your skeleton, like a haunted house meets radiology clinic. Back in hospitals, doctors and technicians were regularly frying themselves with exposure, because protective measures like lead shielding were still decades away from being standard. Many radiologists started losing hair, skin, or entire limbs, earning them the unfortunate nickname, the martyrs of radiology. A particularly grim running joke among doctors of the time was, if you want to know if your X-ray machine is working, just see if your hand starts to itch. And yet, despite the body count and disfiguring burns, the X-ray revolutionized medicine. Suddenly, internal injuries weren't a mystery. Broken bones could be seen, bullets could be located. It was a terrifying, incredible glimpse into the hidden world beneath our skin, and a brutal reminder that scientific progress often comes at a cost, especially if you happen to be the guy standing closest to the beam. Eventually, we figured it out. Lead aprons became standard. Radiation dosages were measured and limited. Machines were shielded. No more glowing foot exams at the mall. And today we casually get chest x-rays before dental cleanings and barely think twice, thanks to a generation of scientists who, quite literally, gave parts of themselves for the cause. Of course, looking back, it's hard not to laugh and wince at how casual people were with invisible radiation. It's like poking an angry tiger just to see what sound it makes, but it also speaks to the boundless curiosity and occasional madness of human progress. We stared into the unknown, didn't blink, and then, when our hands started blistering, finally decided to read the instruction manual. So next time you get an X-ray, and the technician calmly leaves the room while you sit there alone in a lead bib, just remember, you're part of a long, glowing legacy. A legacy that began with curiosity, progressed through third-degree burns, and emerged, finally, with safety protocols. Chapter 9. The telephone hat. Wireless calls before their time. The dream of hands-free communication. Every inventor's favorite fantasy long before we had Bluetooth, AirPods, or the ability to scream at a smart speaker to reorder toilet paper. But before sleek tech and silicone earbuds, before Hey Siri and OK Google, there was something truly majestic, profoundly bizarre, and possibly drafty: the telephone hat. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like, a phone you wore on your head. The future was supposed to be now, and now looked a lot like an uncomfortable steampunk colander, strapped to your skull. The idea of wearable communication dates back much further than most people think. As early as the 1920s and 1930s, inventors were already imagining ways to free people from the tyranny of handheld receivers. After all, what could be more inconvenient than having to use your hands to talk to someone across town? Enter the telephone hat, a head-mounted contraption meant to let you stroll about while conducting your very important conversations, all without lifting a finger or losing your grip on your afternoon martini. One of the earliest and most legendary iterations of the telephone hat came from an obscure 1930s patent application that looked like a cross between a Victorian aviator helmet and a robot's attempt at haute couture. Imagine a pith helmet, wired up with telephone receivers over each ear, a small microphone dangling near the mouth like a nervous spider, and wires trailing down the back like an electrocuted ponytail. Practical? Hardly. Fashionable? Only if you were deeply unpopular at dinner parties. But visionary? Absolutely. The logic wasn't entirely unsound. With telephone infrastructure booming in the early 20th century, inventors knew this tech was going places. Homes and businesses were getting wired. Operators were busy connecting calls faster than a telegraph could blink, and everyone wanted in. Hands-free communication was an obvious next step, but the technology simply wasn't ready. Wireless radio was still a bulky affair, batteries were laughably heavy, and miniaturization was the stuff of science fiction. So if you wanted a mobile phone in 1932, you were going to wear a helmet, like it or not. And it wasn't just fringe inventors who flirted with the idea. The US military even dabbled with head-mounted communication gear during World War II. Bulky, wired helmets with microphones and earpieces built in, used by tank crews and pilots. These weren't exactly dinner party friendly either, but they were functional, and more importantly, they paved the way for the idea that communication could travel with you. Fast forward to the 1960s, and the dream was still alive, except now it came with a turtleneck. Enter the Bell Telephone Company's infamous telephone fashion concept, featuring what might be the most unintentionally hilarious photo spread in tech history. Models stood in mod dresses and wide-collared shirts, wearing telephonic hats that looked like Star Trek cosplay, rejected by the prop department. These prototypes featured push buttons embedded into purses, belts, and yes, headwear. A woman could answer a call by pressing her belt buckle and speak through a discreet mic clipped to her neckline. while earpieces poked out from her Jackie Kennedy-esque hat like curious antenna. Surprisingly, people took it seriously, at least for about 5 minutes. Articles declared it the future of communication. After all, why wouldn't society want to walk around with wires snaking out of their fedoras? The truth is, the telephone hat flopped not because it wasn't a clever idea, but because it arrived about 60 years too early. Technology simply hadn't caught up to the ambition. Today, we carry phones that are more powerful than early NASA computers. We talk into our wrists, shout commands at invisible assistants, and wear sleek, wireless earbuds that can translate languages, play music, and monitor our heart rate. But it all started with those hilarious, clunky, hat-mounted experiments. And honestly, the core idea wasn't half bad. The hat was ridiculous, yes, but the concept was sound free your hands, make communication mobile, and take the conversation with you. Those helmet-wearing pioneers of awkwardness were pointing toward the future, even if they looked like they were auditioning for a role in a Cold War-era sci-fi comedy. So the next time you tap your earpiece or talk into your smartwatch like a secret agent, pour one out for the telephone hat. The metal dome that walked so AirPods could run. The Bluetooth ancestor that wore its wires with pride. The invention that said, why use your hand when you could use your whole head? Chapter 10. Jetpacks, hoverboards, and the dream of flying cars. If there's one thing that unites humanity, besides coffee and regrettable haircut trends, it's the undying belief that by now we should all be flying to work. We were promised a future of airborne commutes, personal jetpacks, gravity-defying boards, and traffic-free skies filled with whooshing freedom. Instead, we got slightly smaller SUVs and scooters that scream in pain if you hit a pebble. Somewhere along the way, the dream of zipping through the clouds became a tangled mess of underwhelming prototypes, exploding engines, and a surprising number of singed eyebrows. Let's start with the poster child of unfulfilled sci-fi dreams, the jetpack. Few inventions have captured the imagination quite like it. The concept has been around since at least the 1920s, when pulp magazines featured men in leather caps soaring through futuristic cities, with nothing but some rocket juice and a dream. And by the 1960s, with the space race heating up and optimism at dangerous levels, the jetpack leapt off the page into a semi-functional, very flammable reality. The Bell rocket belt, one of the first real jetpacks, made its debut in 1961. Weighing 125 pounds and fueled by hydrogen peroxide, because nothing says safe like rocket-grade chemicals strapped to your spine, it could keep you airborne for a whole 20 seconds. That's right, 20. Enough to hover over your neighbor's fence and immediately crash into their lawn furniture. The military was intrigued until they realized the thing could only go 120 meters before running out of fuel and leaving the user stranded like a confused pigeon. Shockingly, it didn't become standard issue, but the dream refused to die. Over the decades, inventors, hobbyists, and questionable YouTubers kept trying to strap propulsion systems to humans. Some of them even succeeded. Sort of. There's Yves Rossi, the jetman, who has flown across the English Channel with a carbon fiber wing and jet engines, looking like Iron Man's daredevil cousin. But even his equipment requires launch assistance and a parachute, which, last time we checked, isn't ideal for commuting to the grocery store. Next on the list of futuristic flops, the hoverboard, not the wheeled death traps from shopping malls that burst into flames in 2016. No, we're talking about the real deal. Back to the future style. Anti-gravity surfboards that let you glide above the ground and flip off physics. In the 1980s, these were a cultural obsession. Everyone knew we'd have them by the year 2000. What we got instead was a bunch of fanboys sticking magnets to planks and screaming, "It hovers," while standing very, very still. The problem, of course, is that hovering is hard. Actual hoverboards require magnetic repulsion or air propulsion, which demands specialized surfaces or massive amounts of power. Lexus built a working magnetic hoverboard in 2015, but it only functioned on a custom magnetic track, which sort of defeats the whole point of go-anywhere travel. It's like inventing a submarine that only works in your bathtub. And then there's the flying car, the holy grail. The answer to every commuter's fantasy and every insurance company's worst nightmare. For over a century, inventors have tried to make a vehicle that can both drive on roads and take off into the sky. Most of these attempts looked like someone crashed a Cessna into a Honda Civic and decided to go with it. In the 1940s, there was the Convair Model 118, a plane car hybrid that managed to fly until it crash-landed during a demo flight, because someone forgot to check the fuel gauge. Whoops! More recently, the Terrafugia Transition promised to revolutionize travel with a foldable wing road-legal aircraft. It did technically fly, and then it disappeared into the black hole of development delays, which is Silicon Valley speak for, we accidentally reinvented disappointment. The consistent problem with flying cars and jetpacks is unfortunately reality. Air travel requires precise physics, complex safety protocols, and massive amounts of fuel. Turning the sky into a freeway full of distracted drivers is not the utopia we imagined. We've seen how people drive on the ground. Do we really want to give them altitude? Still, these wild ideas weren't totally useless. They pushed boundaries. Jetpack technology found niche uses in stunt work and military experiments. Hoverboard research fed into drone design. Flying car projects contributed to vertical takeoff tech that now powers some modern air taxis and cargo drones. The dreams may have fallen short, but they nudged science a little closer to the stars. So yes, the only things that really flew were our hopes and our wallets, but in the grand, ridiculous history of human invention, isn't that kind of the point? We shoot for the moon, land in a tree, and decide the crash was part of the experiment. Because sometimes, to get one step closer to the future, you have to fail spectacularly.